Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into a world of silken secrets where the most privileged women in history wore gowns worth fortunes but couldn't own a single penny of their own money. Where fainting wasn't weakness, it was survival. Where a wrong glance could destroy your reputation forever, and where the golden cage of elite Victorian society held women so tightly that some never breathed freely again. This is the story of what it really meant to be a lady in Victorian England. And trust me, it's nothing like the romance novels tell you. So before we step through the doors of these grand estates together, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, but only if the story truly speaks to you. And I'm curious, where in the world are you watching from right now? Are you tucked in bed in Texas, or perhaps listening from London as dawn breaks? Drop a comment and let me know. I read every single one, and your thoughts mean the world to me. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise, and let's travel back to 1837, when a young queen took the throne and changed everything about what it meant to be a woman of status. Picture this. It's 1853, and you're standing in the grand entrance hall of a townhouse in Mayfair, London. The marble floors gleam like mirrors. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbows across walls covered in silk damask wallpaper that cost more than most families earned in a year. Servants in crisp uniforms move silently through the corridors like ghosts. Everything is perfect. Everything is controlled. Everything is suffocating. You are Lady Catherine, a woman of the upper class. Your husband is a member of Parliament. Your father was an earl. You wear a dress that weighs 14 pounds and required 50 yards of silk. Your corset is laced so tightly that you can barely breathe. But that's the point. Shallow breathing keeps you calm, keeps you quiet, keeps you in your place. You have everything a woman could want, everyone tells you. A beautiful home, a wealthy husband, servants to attend your every need. You should be grateful, but here's what nobody tells you about being a Victorian elite woman. You own nothing, not your clothes, not your jewellery, not even your own children. The moment you said, "I do," everything became your husband's property, including you. Under the law of coverture, you ceased to exist as a separate legal person. Your identity was absorbed into his. If you wrote a book and it became a bestseller, the money was his. If your parents left you an inheritance, it was his. If you wanted to leave, well, where would you go? You had no money, no legal rights, and society would brand you as a fallen woman, a disgrace, someone to be whispered about and shunned. Let me give you a sense of just how divided this world was. Victorian society had layers upon layers, like a wedding cake made of inequality. At the very top you had the royal family and the highest aristocracy. These were people who could trace their lineage back centuries, who owned vast estates and had titles that commanded automatic respect. Below them came the middle upper class, important officers, lords, members of parliament, wealthy landowners who had influence and power but perhaps lacked the ancient bloodlines. And then the lower upper class, successful businessmen, wealthy merchants, professionals who had money but were still clawing their way toward true acceptance. And here's what's fascinating. Even within these tiny subdivisions, the rules were rigid as iron. A middle-upper woman couldn't just walk up and speak to a royal. She had to be properly introduced through someone of appropriate rank. She had to wait for calling cards. She had to follow protocols so complex that entire books were written just to explain them. One etiquette guide from 1876 was over 400 pages long. 400 pages of rules about how to walk, how to sit, how to hold your teacup, how to enter a room, how to address different ranks of people. Get it wrong and you are finished. Now I want you to understand something that might seem contradictory at first. These women had enormous privilege compared to working-class women. They never scrubbed floors, they never worked 12-hour shifts in factories, they never went to bed hungry. They had maids to dress them, cooks to feed them, nannies to raise their children. On paper, their lives looked like paradise. But privilege doesn't equal freedom, and this is where the Victorian elite woman's life becomes truly complex, truly heartbreaking. See, a working-class woman in 1860 might work as a domestic servant or in a factory. The work was brutal, the pay was terrible, the conditions were often dangerous. But, and this is crucial, she could walk down the street without a chaperone. She could laugh loudly if something amused her. She could run if she needed to catch a bus. She could marry for love if she found it. She could even, if she was desperate enough, walk away from a bad situation. She had no money, but she had mobility. She had hardship, but she had agency. An elite woman had the opposite trade-off. She lived in luxury, but couldn't take a step without it being monitored, judged, and controlled. The historian Sally Mitchell wrote that Victorian upper-class women were the most constrained by etiquette precisely because they had the most to lose. One scandal, one whisper of impropriety, and centuries of family reputation could crumble. So these women learned to move through the world like they were walking on eggshells made of the thinnest glass. Let me paint you a picture of a typical day, because I think this is where you'll really start to feel what this life was like. You wake up at 7 in the morning and immediately your lady's maid comes in to help you dress. You can't dress yourself, not because you're incapable, but because your clothes are designed to require assistance. There are buttons down the back you can't reach. There are corset laces that need to be pulled with considerable force. There are layers upon layers of undergarments, each one serving a specific purpose in creating the fashionable silhouette of the era. By 8 o'clock you're dressed and you descend to the breakfast room. But here's something that might surprise you. Many elite Victorian women barely ate breakfast. The ideal waist size was 18 inches or smaller, and achieving that meant constant restriction, constant hunger, constant control. So you might have weak tea and a piece of dry toast while your husband enjoys a full English breakfast with eggs, bacon, sausages, mushroom, tomatoes, and toast with butter and marmalade. You watch him eat. Your stomach growls. You ignore it. This is what ladies do. After breakfast, your day stretches ahead like an empty canvas, but it's a canvas where someone else has already decided what you're allowed to paint. You might do some embroidery, you might practice the piano, you might read, but only certain books deemed appropriate for female sensibilities. Novels were acceptable, barely. Poetry was lovely, but philosophy, science, political theory, those were men's subjects, and reading them too enthusiastically could mark you as odd, unfeminine, possibly even hysterical. Yes, reading the wrong books could literally get you diagnosed with a medical condition. We'll talk more about that later. Around 3 o'clock, the social ritual of calling begins. This is where elite women did much of their real work, though it was never called work because ladies didn't work. You would either pay calls on other women of your acquaintance or receive calls at home. These weren't friendly chats over coffee like we might have today. These were strategic social maneuvers, carefully choreographed performances where every word, every gesture, every minute detail carried meaning. If you went to call on someone, you couldn't just show up. First, you had to send your calling card in advance to express interest in visiting. If the lady of the house accepted, you would arrive during designated calling hours, usually between 3 and 6 in the afternoon. Your visit would last exactly 15 to 20 minutes. Not 14 minutes, not 21 minutes, 15 to 20. You would sit in the drawing room, make polite conversation about neutral topics, drink tea, and then depart. The entire interaction was governed by unspoken rules that everyone somehow just knew. And here's where it gets really interesting. These calling rituals weren't just about being chill, they were about power. They were about drawing the boundaries of who was in and who was out. They were about maintaining class distinctions in an era when new money from industrialization was threatening the old social order. if you wanted to keep your position, if you wanted to protect your family's reputation, if you wanted to ensure your daughters married well, you had to play this game perfectly. One misstep, arriving at the wrong hour, staying too long, speaking too freely, and you could find yourself gradually excluded from invitation lists, from social circles, from the world that gave your life meaning and structure. The writer Lady Colin Campbell, who published a guide to etiquette in 1893, wrote something that I find absolutely chilling. She said, "You cannot invite people to your home, however often you may have met them elsewhere, until you have first called upon them in a formal manner and they have returned the visit." Think about that. You could know someone for years, you could like them enormously, but you couldn't have them over for dinner until you'd completed this elaborate ritual dance of cards and calls and returns. Friendship wasn't something that grew naturally. It was something that had to be formally established through proper channels. Now, while all this calling and visiting is happening, your husband is at his club or at Parliament, or at his office managing investments, or riding in the park with his friends. He moves through the world freely. He makes decisions. He spends money. Your money, technically, since everything you brought to the marriage became his. He might have interests, hobbies, intellectual pursuits. He might travel. He might have affairs, honestly, because Victorian morality had one standard for men and a completely different, far more restrictive standard for women. But you're in the drawing room counting the minutes of your calling visits, making sure you don't overstay, making sure you don't say anything too interesting or too dull, making sure you're perfectly pleasant, perfectly appropriate, perfectly controlled. You're performing femininity as if your life depends on it. Because in a very real sense, it does. The doctrine of separate spheres was the philosophy that governed all of this. The idea was that men and women had fundamentally different natures and therefore fundamentally different roles. Men belonged to the public sphere, business, politics, intellectual life, the rough and tumble world outside the home. Women belonged to the private sphere, home, family, moral guidance, creating a peaceful sanctuary where men could retreat from the harsh realities of public life. Women were called the angel in the house, a phrase from a poem by Coventry Patmore that became the ideal every Victorian woman was supposed to embody. An angel in the house was selfless, pure, devoted, gentle, submissive, and completely focused on the well-being of her husband and children. She had no desires of her own, no ambitions, no frustrations. She existed to serve and to suffer beautifully. And here's the trap. If you were an elite woman, you had to perform this role perfectly while also being an ornament, a status symbol that reflected your husband's wealth and position. You had to be an angel, but an angel wearing the latest Paris fashions and hosting flawless dinner parties and maintaining an elegant home that impressed everyone who entered it. The contradictions were exhausting. Be perfect but not intimidating. Be beautiful but not vain. Be accomplished but not ambitious. Be intelligent but not intellectual. Be interesting but not too interesting. Be visible but silent. Shine but don't outshine your husband. It was like being asked to walk a tightrope while wearing a blindfold and 14 pounds of silk, and if you cracked under the pressure, if you showed frustration or sadness or anger, if you wanted something more than this beautiful, suffocating existence, well, then you might find yourself diagnosed with hysteria, or neurasthenia, or melancholia, or any number of other conditions that were basically Victorian medicine's way of saying, this woman is inconveniently unhappy with her lot in life. And the treatments for these conditions, we'll get into this more later, were often worse than the diseases themselves. Queen Victoria herself set the standard for this impossible ideal. She reigned from 1837 until 1901, and during that time she became the symbol of domestic femininity, even though she was literally ruling an empire. She had 9 children and was devoted to her husband, Prince Albert. After Albert died in 1861, she mourned him for the rest of her life, wearing black and withdrawing from public life for years. She became the model of wifely devotion, maternal duty, and feminine virtue, and every woman of the upper classes was expected to emulate her example, minus the empire ruling part, of course. That was a masculine prerogative. But here's something I find both sad and darkly ironic. Victoria had more power than perhaps any woman in the world at that time, and she used that power to support a system that oppressed other women. She opposed women's suffrage. She believed women were naturally inferior to men in matters of politics and business. She once wrote that women's rights activists were mad, wicked folly. The woman with the most power was the one saying that other women shouldn't have any. So as we close this first chapter of our journey, I want you to hold on to this image. A woman standing in a beautiful drawing room, wearing a dress that costs a fortune and hurts with every breath. She's surrounded by luxury, silk curtains, Persian rugs, oil paintings, fresh flowers, gleaming silver. Servants hover nearby, ready to fulfill her every wish. But she can't choose what to wear tomorrow. She can't decide whether to go for a walk. She can't keep her own money. She can't express her own opinions freely. She can't even choose whether to have another child or not. She's trapped in a golden cage, and everyone keeps telling her how lucky she is to be there. And the most heartbreaking part? Many of these women believed it. They internalized the message that this was the natural order, that this was how things should be, that wanting anything else made them selfish or unnatural or sick. The cage wasn't just made of social rules and legal restrictions. It was made of ideas, beliefs, and expectations that lived inside their own minds. But the human spirit is a stubborn thing, and as we'll discover in the coming parts of this story, that beautiful, expensive, suffocating facade was hiding some dark truths. We're going to peel back those silk curtains and look at what was really happening in Victorian elite society. We were going to talk about the deadly fashions that literally killed women in the name of beauty. We're going to explore the intricate social games that determined who survived and who fell. We're going to meet the doctors who called women crazy for wanting to read, the husbands who held absolute power, and the brave rebels who fought back despite knowing it could destroy them. Because here's the thing about golden cages. They might be beautiful, but they're still cages, and every cage, no matter how gilded, eventually shows its bars. So stay with me as we journey deeper into this world of silk dresses and silent falls, where privilege and oppression dance together in the gaslit ballrooms of Victorian England, and where women learn to survive by learning to disappear. Next, we're going to talk about something that might shock you. How the very clothes these women wore were quietly killing them, one beautiful garment at a time. Now, imagine you're getting dressed for a ball. It's 1862 and tonight is one of the most important social events of the season. Your maid has been preparing for hours. She brings out your gown and it's absolutely breathtaking, a magnificent creation in the most fashionable colour of the era. A brilliant, luminous green that seems to glow in the candlelight. The fabric shimmers like emeralds. Everyone will be wearing green this season. It's the colour that makes you look alive, vibrant, expensive. It's the colour that will make you the envy of every woman in the room. Is also the colour that might kill you. Welcome to the darker side of Victorian fashion, where beauty came with a body count, and getting dressed could be your last act. Because here's something they don't tell you in those costume dramas. Victorian women weren't just constrained by their clothes, they were literally poisoned, burned, and crushed by them. Fashion wasn't just uncomfortable, it was deadly. Let's start with that gorgeous green dress I just described. That particular shade of green, so vibrant, so coveted, was created using a chemical compound discovered in the late 1770s by the Swedish-German chemist named Carl Wilhelm Scheele. The colour became known as Scheele's green, and later as Paris green, and it was an absolute sensation. Finally, dressmakers could create a true bright green without having to layer blue and yellow dyes that always look muddy. This green was pure, brilliant, and appeared in everything from ball gowns to wallpaper, to children's toys to artificial flowers worn in hair. Here's the small problem. The pigment was made by combining copper arsenite with white arsenic. Yes, arsenic, the same poison that shows up in murder mysteries. Victorian women were literally wearing poison on their skin, breathing in poison particles as the fabric moved, absorbing poison through sweat on hot summer nights at crowded balls. The factory workers who dyed the fabrics had it worst. There are documented reports of dyers developing sores, scabs, and damaged tissue on their hands and arms. They suffered from nausea, colic, diarrhea, and constant headaches. Some went blind, some died. But the fashion industry kept using arsenic dyes because they created colours that customers demanded, and custom demand mattered more than worker safety. Sound familiar? We like to think we've come so far, but fast fashion today has its own dark secrets in factories overseas. Now you might be thinking, okay, but surely elite women weren't exposed to the same levels as factory workers, right? And you'd be partially correct. The women wearing these dresses weren't dying immediately from acute arsenic poisoning. But chronic exposure is a different story. There are accounts from the era of women developing mysterious rashes and skin conditions after wearing green gowns. Some experienced hair loss, nausea, headaches that wouldn't go away, and here's the really insidious part, nobody connected it to their clothing. These symptoms were often attributed to female hysteria, to nerves, to the supposed fragility of the feminine constitution. The poisoning was happening, but the true cause was invisible, hiding in plain sight beneath layers of beautiful fabric. Even Queen Victoria was painted wearing an arsenic green gown in official portraits. The colour was that popular, that prestigious. If poisoning yourself was fashionable, well, ladies were expected to do it with grace, but arsenic wasn't the only threat lurking in a Victorian wardrobe. Let me tell you about something called flannelette. This was a cotton fabric brushed to create a soft nap that resembled wool flannel, and it became enormously popular for nightshirts and undergarments in the late 19th century. It was comfortable, it was affordable, and it caught fire instantly if it came anywhere near a flame. Picture this scenario, which happened over and over in Victorian households. A woman in her nightdress goes to light a candle or tends to the fireplace. Her loose flannelette gown trails near the flame. In seconds, she's engulfed. The fabric doesn't just burn, it explodes into fire. And those voluminous skirts, all that fabric, it becomes a death trap. Women ran screaming through their homes, the fire spreading faster than anyone could react. The fabric melting and sticking to their skin. The burns were catastrophic. Many died. One of the most famous victims was a ballerina named Clara Webster. In 1844, she was performing at London's Drury Lane Theatre. The stage had gaslights recessed into the floor. A modern innovation that created beautiful lighting effects but also created a hazard. During her performance, Clara's tulle dress, made of that machine-woven cotton lace that was stiffened with highly combustible starch, brushed against one of those sunken lights. She went up like a torch in front of a packed theatre. The audience watched in horror as she burned to death on stage. She was just 17 years old. But Clara wasn't alone, not by a long shot. Records from Victorian London hospitals show that dress fires were a leading cause of death for women. One hospital reported that between 1830 and 1849, they treated over 180 women for severe burns from clothing fires, and many of those women died from their injuries. This wasn't rare. This wasn't unusual. This was a known, accepted risk of being a woman in the Victorian era. And yet fashion didn't change. Women kept wearing these enormous crinolines, those cage-like structures that held their skirts out in huge bell shapes. At their peak in the 1850s and 60s, crinolines could measure 4 meters in circumference. 4 meters. That's over 13 feet around. Imagine trying to navigate a room with a 13-foot wide skirt. Imagine trying to avoid open fires, candles, gas lamps, all while carrying all that flammable fabric. It was like wearing kindling. There are darkly comic stories, if you can call them that, of women getting stuck in doorways, knocking over furniture, being unable to sit down in carriages. But the fires were no joke. An 1863 article in the London medical journal The Lancet called Crinoline Fires a Holocaust of Death. They estimated that over 3,000 women had died from crinoline fires in the previous few years alone. 3,000 women gone because fashion demanded they wear what amounted to a portable bonfire. Now let's talk about what women wore under those fire hazard skirts. The corset. Oh, the corset. You've probably heard that corsets were uncomfortable, right? But I don't think you truly understand just how dangerous they were until you hear the details. A Victorian corset was designed to reshape the body into an unnatural hourglass silhouette. The ideal waist measurement was 18 inches or smaller. To put that in perspective, the average waist of a healthy adult woman is between 27 and 32 inches today. Victorian women were expected to compress their waists by 10 to 14 inches. To achieve this, corsets were made with steel or whalebone stays and were laced with tremendous force, sometimes requiring 2 maids pulling in opposite directions to achieve maximum tightness. What happens when you compress a human torso that drastically? Well, let's walk through it. First, your lungs can't fully expand. You're forced to take shallow breaths, which means less oxygen reaching your brain and body. This leads to fatigue, dizziness, and yes, fainting. Victorian women fainting wasn't a sign of delicate femininity. It was a sign of oxygen deprivation. Second, your ribs, which are designed to protect your organs, are forced to compress inward. There are documented medical cases from the era of women with permanently deformed rib cages. Their ribs had actually been pushed out of their natural position by years of tight lacing. Some women's ribs overlapped. Others had ribs that had partially fused together. X-rays taken of Victorian women in the early 20th century, when X-rays became available, showed skeletal deformities that doctors had never seen before and haven't seen since. Third, your internal organs have nowhere to go. Your liver, stomach, intestines, uterus, all of them get compressed and pushed downward. This caused chronic digestive issues, difficulty eating, constant indigestion. Many Victorian women could only eat tiny amounts at meals, not by choice but because their stomachs were literally squished. And pregnancy? Imagine being pregnant while your uterus is being compressed by steel stays. The complications were horrific, though rarely discussed in polite society. There's a physician from the era named Dr. Arabella Keneally who wrote extensively about the damage corsets were causing. In an 1893 article, she described examining patients whose livers had been pushed down into their pelvic regions, their livers, organs that are supposed to be tucked safely under the rib cage, protecting them, processing toxins, keeping the body functioning. These women's livers were displaced by several inches because of their corsets. Dr. Keneally called it the slow murder of women by fashion. But here's the tragic irony. Women who didn't wear corsets were considered indecent, unfeminine, even scandalous. There are records of women being arrested for walking around without corsets in public, accused of being prostitutes because they weren't properly restrained. The corset wasn't just a garment, it was a symbol of respectability, of self-control, of feminine virtue. To not wear one was to declare yourself outside the bounds of proper society. Some young girls started wearing corsets as early as age 10 or 11, their growing bodies being shaped and restricted before they'd even finished developing. Mothers believed they were training their daughters for proper womanhood, teaching them discipline and decorum. In reality, they were stunting their growth and damaging their health in ways that would last a lifetime. And then there's the weight. I mentioned earlier that Victorian dresses could weigh 14 pounds or more, but let me break down exactly what that means. 14 pounds might not sound like much. It's about the weight of a bowling ball. But imagine carrying a bowling ball around all day, every day, with the weight distributed unevenly across your body, pulling on your shoulders, your waist, your hips. Your muscles are constantly strained. Your back aches, your neck hurts. You can't move quickly or freely. Every step requires effort. The weight came from multiple sources. First, there were the layers of undergarments, chemise, drawers, multiple petticoats, the corset, the crinoline or bustle structure. Then came the dress itself, which for an evening gown would be made of heavy silk, velvet or brocade. These fabrics were thick, luxurious and very, very heavy. Then there were the embellishments, beading, embroidery, lace trim, ribbon, fringe, tassels. Some ball gowns were decorated with actual gemstones sewn into the fabric. And finally there were the trains, those long sections of fabric that trailed behind a woman as she walked, dragging across floors, picking up dirt and dust, adding even more weight. Can you imagine dancing in 14 pounds of fabric? Because that's what was expected. Elite women attended balls that lasted for hours, and they were expected to dance, to move gracefully, to make it all look effortless. They practiced at home for hours, learning to maneuver in their heavy gowns, learning to turn without tripping, learning to climb stairs without falling. It was athletic training disguised as feminine accomplishment. And speaking of those trains, let me tell you about the filth. Victorian city streets were not clean places. There was horse manure everywhere, mud, garbage, all sorts of unmentionable things. When women walked outside, their long skirts dragged through all of it. The hems of expensive silk gowns became caked with street filth. Women's shoes were constantly soiled, and they brought all of that bacteria and disease back into their homes, trailing it across their clean floors, their carpets, their furniture. There was actually a public health debate in the 1880s about whether women's fashions were contributing to the spread of disease. Some doctors argued that those trailing skirts were moving germs from the streets into homes, hospitals and public spaces. But fashion didn't change. Women just hired more servants to clean constantly, to scrub and wash and try to keep up with the mess that fashionable clothing created. Now, let's talk about hats for a moment, because Victorian hat fashion deserves its own special place in the Hall of Deadly Trends. In the late Victorian era, elaborate hats became all the rage, and by elaborate, I mean enormous confections decorated with silk flowers, ribbons, and most dramatically exotic bird feathers and sometimes entire stuffed birds. The plume trade became a massive industry. Hunters travelled to places like the Florida Everglades to shoot birds for their feathers, egrets, herons, ibises, sometimes rare tropical birds. By 1899, over 5 million birds were being killed every year to supply feathers for hats. 95% of Florida's shorebirds had been slaughtered. Entire species were on the brink of extinction because Victorian women wanted to wear dead birds on their heads. But the danger wasn't just to the birds. Remember how I mentioned taxidermists, the people who stuffed and preserved those birds for hat decorations, used arsenic-laced soaps and solutions? So now women were wearing arsenic-preserved dead animals on their heads, often positioned right above their faces, where they could breathe in the fumes all day. One fashion commentator of the era, a writer named Mrs. Hawise began an 1887 essay with the memorable line, "A corpse is never a really pleasant ornament." She wasn't worried about the arsenic, though. She was worried about the aesthetics. Men's fashion had its own deadly component, mercury. Hatmakers used mercury to turn stiff animal fur into the smooth, malleable felt used for top hats and other formal headwear. The phrase "mad as a hatter" comes from this practice, because mercury poisoning causes tremors, mood swings, memory problems, and eventually severe neurological damage. Hatmakers in the Victorian era often developed what was called hatter's shakes, and many ended up in asylums, their minds destroyed by the very product they'd spent years crafting. And here's what gets me about all of this. People knew. Medical journals were publishing articles about arsenic poisoning. Newspapers were reporting on crinoline fires. Doctors were documenting the damage from tight lacing. This wasn't secret information. It was right there in black and white for anyone who cared to read it. But fashion was more powerful than facts. Social pressure was more powerful than safety. The desire to be beautiful, to be admired, to fit in, that desire was powerful enough that women continued wearing clothes that hurt them, that poisoned them, that could quite literally kill them at any moment. And society continued demanding that they do so, because a woman's appearance was considered more important than her health, her comfort, or even her life. Think about that the next time you see a painting of a Victorian ball. All those women in their gorgeous gowns looking elegant and serene. Now imagine that beneath those beautiful surfaces, they're gasping for breath. Their organs are compressed. Their skin is breaking out in rashes from arsenic, and they're one stray spark away from going up in flames. That's the reality that the paintings don't show you. That's the price that was paid for beauty in the Victorian age. And the most heartbreaking part? Women internalized this. They believed it was their duty to suffer for beauty, that discomfort was a small price to pay for being admired, that risking their health was just part of being a proper lady. They didn't have the language to say this is abuse or this is oppression. They only had the language of fashion, of duty, of feminine virtue. So they laced their corsets tighter, wore their arsenic gowns, and hoped they'd make it through the evening without fainting or catching fire. Modern women talk about beauty standards and the pressure to look a certain way, and those pressures are real. But at least today wearing mascara won't give you arsenic poisoning. High heels might hurt your feet, but they won't crush your liver. We've come a long way, but I think it's worth remembering where we came from and how recently this was normal, accepted, expected. It's only been about 120 years since this era ended. That's within living memory of some people's great-grandparents. This isn't ancient history. This is yesterday, really, in the grand scope of human existence. So the next time you struggle with skinny jeans or a too tight waistband and think, fashion is uncomfortable, just remember, at least your clothes probably won't kill you. That's progress, my friends. That's actual progress. But if you think the deadly dresses were the only invisible threat these women faced, you're in for a surprise. Because the social world they navigated was just as dangerous as their clothing, just as capable of destroying a life in an instant. And it all came down to a small piece of paper that held enormous power. Stay with me as we enter the intricate, ruthless world of calling cards and social survival, where a single mistake could mean social death, and where women became the enforcers of their own imprisonment. You know what's fascinating? We think social media is modern, right? We think Instagram and Facebook and TikTok invented the concept of curating your social circle, broadcasting your status, and carefully managing your public image. But Victorian women were doing all of that 150 years ago with nothing but small rectangles of cardboard and an elaborate set of unspoken rules that could make or break your entire existence. Let me introduce you to the calling card. the Victorian era's answer to social media. And honestly, it was just as brutal, just as strategic, and just as capable of ruining your life as anything we deal with online today. Here's how it worked. Imagine you're holding a small piece of thick cardstock, roughly 3.5 inches by 2.5 inches if you're a gentleman, or about 4 inches square if you're a lady. Your card is larger because, well, you need more room. On this card is your name printed in simple, elegant typeface. If you're married, it might say Mrs. James Harrison. Notice, not Mrs. Catherine Harrison. Your first name disappears when you marry. You become your husband's property right down to your calling card. If you're of high rank, your title appears Lady Pemberton or the Countess of Devonshire. By the late 1800s, your address might be included, and if you're a lady who receives visitors on a particular day, that information goes on there too, Tuesdays 3 to 5. This little card is your passport into society. Without it, you don't exist. With it, you can navigate the complex social hierarchy of Victorian England, if you know the rules. And oh my goodness, the rules. There were so many rules that etiquette books dedicated entire chapters to the proper use of calling cards. One guide from 1876 devoted 47 pages, 47, to calling card protocol alone. Let's walk through a scenario because I think that's the best way to understand just how intricate this system was. You're a newly married woman who's just arrived in London for the social season. Your husband has rented a townhouse in a fashionable neighbourhood, maybe Belgravia or Mayfair. You're excited to make connection, to enter society, to begin your life as a married woman of standing. But you can't just knock on doors and introduce yourself. That would be incredibly vulgar, shockingly forward, absolutely unthinkable. Instead, you must wait for the established ladies of the neighbourhood to call on you first. They're under no obligation to do so, by the way. They might leave you hanging for weeks, silently evaluating whether you're worthy of their attention. They'll make discreet inquiries. Who is your family? Who did you marry? What's his income? What's your reputation? If they deem you acceptable, eventually a servant will arrive at your door with their calling card. The servant won't wait for a response. They'll simply hand over the card and leave. This card is an invitation to reciprocate. Within 3 days, not 2, not 4, exactly 3 days, you must send your maid with your own calling cards to that lady's home. You'll leave 2 of your cards, one for the lady of the house and one of your husband's cards for her husband, even though the men will probably never actually call on each other. This is all about the women managing the social network. If your card is accepted, the lady might send a return card inviting you to call at a specific time. And here's where it gets really particular. You must arrive during designated calling hours, which in most fashionable neighbourhoods meant between 3 and 6 o'clock in the afternoon. Arrive earlier and you're presumptuous. Arrive later and you're inconsiderate. You must stay for 15 to 20 minutes, not 10, not 30, 15 to 20. There were women who literally time their visits with pocket watches. During your visit, you sit in the drawing room and make polite conversation about approved topics, the weather, perhaps an art exhibition, maybe a charitable cause, the health of mutual acquaintances. You do not discuss politics, money, religion, or anything controversial. You do not sit down until invited to do so. You do not remove your gloves. You do not overstay your welcome. And when you leave, you must fold down one corner of your calling card in a specific way to indicate what type of visit this was. A congratulatory visit, a condolence visit, a farewell before travelling. Different corner folds meant different things, and everyone just somehow knew this silent language. Now here's the thing that makes this system so insidious. It wasn't designed to facilitate genuine friendship. It was designed as a social filtering mechanism, a way for the upper classes to maintain their exclusivity while industrialization and new wealth threatened the old order. As one historian put it, The calling card system was created to contain society against the social climbers. Think about that phrase, contain society, not build community or foster friendship. Contain, keep out the undesirables, maintain the boundaries, protect the elite from contamination by new money, by people who didn't understand the unspoken rules, by anyone who threatened the comfortable hierarchy. And women were the enforcers of this system. Men could be members of the same club or serve together in parliament, but that didn't mean their wives had to acknowledge each other socially. Women decided who was in and who was out. They were the gatekeepers, the arbiters of social acceptability. It gave them a certain kind of power, but it was power used to oppress other women, to maintain a system that ultimately oppressed them all. Let me tell you what happened if you made a mistake in this elaborate dance. Let's say you called on someone without sending your card first, or you stayed 30 minutes instead of 20, or you discussed politics in the drawing room, or you sent a card with the wrong corner folded down. These weren't minor faux pas, these were social catastrophes. Word would spread. Victorian ladies were excellent gossips, by the way, since gossip was one of the few forms of power available to them. You'd find that invitations stopped arriving. Other women would claim to be not at home when you called. Your cards would pile up unanswered. You'd be frozen out, ostracized, socially dead. And if you were socially dead in Victorian elite society, what did you have left? Your entire life was built around these social connections. Your husband's career might depend on the right social alliances. Your daughter's marriage prospects certainly did. Your own sense of identity and purpose was wrapped up in your social position. Being cut out of society wasn't just embarrassing, it was devastating, existentially threatening. There's a wonderful, or maybe horrible, depending on how you look at it, example from an 1893 etiquette book by Lady Colin Campbell. She wrote, "You cannot invite people to your home, however often you may have met them elsewhere, until you have first called upon them in a formal manner and they have returned the visit." Read that again. You could work with someone's wife on a charity committee for 5 years. You could genuinely like her, find her interesting, want to know her better, but you couldn't invite her to dinner unless the proper calling card ritual had been completed first. Friendship couldn't develop naturally. Every relationship had to be initiated through formal channels with formal procedures following formal rules. Can you imagine? It's like if today you couldn't be friends with someone until you'd both filled out forms and followed a specific protocol. Oh wait, actually, maybe social media isn't so different after all. Think about LinkedIn connection requests, or how people carefully curate who can see their Instagram posts, or the unspoken rules about liking and commenting. We might not have calling cards, but we definitely have invisible social protocols that govern our digital interactions. But here's where the Victorian system was even more vicious. There was a physical artifact of your social standing. In the entrance hall of every upper-class home sat a silver tray, prominently displayed, where calling cards were left. And this tray wasn't just functional, it was a status symbol in itself. Visitors entering your home would see the tray and they could see whose cards were on it. The cards of the most prestigious visitors were deliberately placed on top. It was a form of social proof, a way to advertise your connections. Imagine walking into someone's home and seeing the Duchess of Marlborough's card on top of the pile. That told you something about the family's social standing. They knew duchesses. They were the sort of people duchesses called upon. You'd better be on your best behaviour, because clearly this family had serious social clout. Conversely, if your card was the only one on the tray, that also told a story. Maybe this family was new to society, not well connected, struggling to break in, or maybe they'd done something to offend people and were being quietly shunned. The tray was a public record of your social success or failure right there in your entrance hall for everyone to see, and women managed all of this. It was the lady of the house who decided which cards to display prominently, which to bury in the pile, which to discard entirely. It was women who maintained the complex mental database of who had called on whom, who owed visits to whom, who was feuding with whom, who was rising in society and who was falling. Men had business and politics. Women had the calling card system, and honestly, I'm not sure which was more cutthroat. The pressure on young women was particularly intense. If you were a girl making your debut in society, we'll talk more about the debutante system later, your mother's ability to navigate calling card protocol could determine your entire future. A well-connected mother with an impressive card tray could ensure her daughter received invitations to the right balls, met the right people, attracted the right suitors. A mother who was socially clumsy or not well connected could doom her daughter to spinsterhood or a bad marriage. So girls watched their mothers obsessively, learning the system, memorizing the rules, understanding that their life prospects depended on mastering this bizarre social choreography. It was like training for a sport where the rules were never explicitly stated. The competition was constant, and losing meant not getting a second chance at the game. There were regional variations too, which made everything even more complicated. Calling hours might be different in Edinburgh than in London. The protocol for morning visits varied. Some neighbourhoods were more formal than others. If you moved, you had to learn a whole new set of unspoken local customs. And heaven help you if you were American or from another country trying to break into English society. You were automatically suspect, automatically at a disadvantage, and you'd have to work twice as hard to prove you understood the rules. Oscar Wilde, the famous writer, had strong opinions about this system. His own calling card from 1897 survives. It's quite simple, just his name in elegant script. But he wrote satirically about the absurdity of Victorian social customs in his plays. In The Importance of Being Earnest, one character says, "I have always been of opinion that a man who desires to get married should know either everything or nothing." That line was about calling cards, actually, the joke being that you needed to know everything about social protocol or nothing at all, because partial knowledge was dangerous. And here's something I find particularly interesting. The calling card system began to decline in the early 1900s, but it didn't disappear completely. It evolved into the modern business card, same basic function, portable credential, way to make connections, tool for networking. But business cards are egalitarian in a way calling cards never were. Anyone can have a business card. They're about professional identity, not social rank. You can hand them out freely without worrying about protocols. The formality is gone, the gatekeeping is gone, the rigid hierarchy is gone. But you know what's not gone? The fundamental human need to signal belonging, to show status, to carefully manage how we're perceived by others. We've just moved the arena from silver trays in entrance halls to follower counts on social media, from calling cards to verified check marks, from the right neighbourhood to the right online communities. Victorian women spent hours managing their calling card strategy. Today we spend hours managing our social media presence. They worried about being left off invitation lists. We worry about not being invited to group chats. They displayed prestigious connections on silver trays. We tag prestigious connections in Instagram posts. The technology has changed, but the underlying social dynamics, the competition, the anxiety, the performance of status, those are remarkably similar, except here's one crucial difference. Victorian women had no choice. They couldn't opt out of the calling card system without becoming social outcasts. Their entire lives were structured around these rituals. Today, at least in theory, we can choose to disconnect, to step away from social media, to refuse to play status games. We have options that they didn't have. Whether we exercise those options is another question, but they exist. And I think that's worth reflecting on as we think about these Victorian women spending their afternoons in drawing rooms, timing their visits, folding card corners, navigating invisible rules, competing desperately for social position. They didn't have a choice. The system was mandatory. Break the rules and lose everything. So they followed the rules, they played the game, they became experts in reading subtle social signals, in managing relationships strategically, in presenting carefully curated versions of themselves to the world. They turned social interaction into a performance, friendship into a calculation, community into a competition, and they taught their daughters to do the same, passing down this exhausting, dehumanizing system from generation to generation because they couldn't imagine any alternative. The calling card was a small thing physically, just a piece of cardboard with a name on it. But it represented something much larger, a whole system of social control, a mechanism for maintaining hierarchy, a tool for ensuring that women policed each other and themselves, keeping everyone in line, preserving the status quo, preventing anyone from stepping out of their designated place in the social order. And the cruelest part? Women wielded this tool against each other while believing they were upholding standards, maintaining civilization, protecting society from chaos. They were simultaneously victims and enforcers, oppressed and oppressors, trapped in a system that gave them just enough power to help maintain their own imprisonment. But if you thought the calling card ritual was elaborate, wait until you see what happened when these women actually sat down to dine together. Because the dinner table was where social warfare reached its peak, where a single misstep could be more deadly than any poison, and where the performance of respectability became so complex that surviving a meal felt like surviving a battle. Let's step into the dining room and discover what these women really faced when they gathered to eat. The invitation arrives on heavy cream cardstock delivered by a liveried footman. You're invited to dinner at the home of Lord and Lady Ashworth, one of the most influential couples in your social circle. The date is set for Saturday evening, 7 o'clock sharp. You should be excited. This is exactly the kind of invitation that could elevate your social standing, create valuable connections, secure your place in the upper echelons of society. Instead, you're terrified. Because a Victorian dinner party wasn't just a meal, it was a minefield. It was a test you could fail in 1,000 different ways, and failure meant humiliation, gossip, and social exile. You could make it through arsenic-laced gowns and crushing corsets, but one wrong fork at dinner could undo you completely. Let me take you through what attending this dinner party actually meant, and I promise you, it's more stressful than any job interview or first date you've ever experienced in your life. First, there's the matter of what to wear. For an evening dinner party, and by evening Victorians meant anything after 6 o'clock, you need an evening gown. This is different from your afternoon dress, your morning dress, your walking dress, or your tea gown. Each occasion demands specific attire, and showing up in the wrong type of dress is an immediate signal that you don't understand social conventions. Your evening gown must have a low, wide neckline, not scandalously low, but low enough to show your collarbones and shoulders. Your sleeves must be small and close-fitting, unlike the voluminous sleeves you'd wear during the day. And here's the practical reason for this, which is actually kind of brilliant. The long sleeves you wore during the day would drag through food, knock over wine glasses, and generally cause chaos at a dining table laden with multiple courses and elaborate centerpieces. So evening wear had short sleeves to prevent accidents, fashion-serving function for once. Your gown would be made of luxurious fabric, silk, satin, or taffeta, and it must be immaculately clean. It should shimmer in candlelight. You'd wear gloves, of course, though you'd remove them before eating. Your hair would be arranged in an elaborate style, probably incorporating false hair pieces because the fashionable coiffures of the era required more hair than most women naturally possessed. And jewellery, you'd wear your best pieces, but not so much that you look gaudy, just enough to signal wealth without appearing desperate to prove it. You arrive at exactly 7 o'clock, not 6:55, not 7:05, exactly 7. Punctuality is crucial. A butler or the footman opens the door and takes your wrap. You're announced, Mrs. Catherine Harrison, and you enter the drawing room where the other guests are assembling for pre-dinner drinks and conversation. This is your first test. Who do you greet first? The hosts, obviously, but then what? You need to acknowledge the highest-ranking guest in the room next. But how do you know who that is? Well, you're supposed to just know. You're supposed to have memorized the social hierarchy, to recognize titles and ranks on sight, to intuitively understand who takes precedence over whom. Get it wrong and you've insulted someone important before dinner has even begun. The drawing room conversation lasts perhaps 30 minutes. You sip sherry or champagne, but just sip, never gulp. You make pleasant small talk. You absolutely do not discuss anything controversial, and you wait for the signal that dinner is ready. When that signal comes, here's where things get really interesting. The host offers his arm to the highest-ranking lady in the room who is not his wife. The lady of the house takes the arm of the highest-ranking gentleman who is not her husband, and then everyone else pairs up according to a strict order of precedence based on title, age, and social standing. This procession into the dining room isn't random, it's a public display of the social hierarchy, a reminder to everyone of their exact place in the pecking order. Now you're seated at the table, and the real performance begins. Let me describe what you're looking at, because Victorian formal dining was extravagant to an almost absurd degree. The table is covered with a pristine white linen cloth. On it sits an elaborate centerpiece, maybe a massive silver epergne filled with fruit and flowers, or an ornamental fountain, or even a miniature garden complete with live ferns and tropical plants. Some tables had such tall centerpieces that guests literally couldn't see the people sitting across from them. They'd have to lean to the side to make conversation, which must have been incredibly awkward. In front of you is a place setting that could double as a modern art installation. Multiple plates stacked together, 6 different glasses for water, champagne, white wine, red wine, sherry, and port, and forks. Oh my goodness, the forks! There might be 8 or 9 different utensils arranged around your plate. Oyster forks, fish forks, salad forks, meat forks, dessert forks. Each one slightly different in size and shape. Each one designated for a specific course. Use the wrong fork and everyone notices. Everyone knows you're ignorant of proper etiquette. One American woman who married into British aristocracy in the 1880s wrote in her diary about the panic she felt facing all those utensils at her first formal dinner. She wrote, "I simply followed what the lady next to me did, praying constantly that she knew what she was doing and I wouldn't discover too late that I'd been taking cues from someone equally confused." The meal itself typically consisted of 10 to 14 courses. Let me list them for you so you can appreciate the absurdity. First, soup, maybe a clear consommé or a thick bisque. Then fish, poached salmon or sole with delicate sauce. Then an entree, which in Victorian terminology meant something like vol au vent or croquettes, not the main course. Then the relevé, which was a substantial dish like roasted game. Then the actual main course, roasted beef or lamb or venison. Then vegetables prepared separately. Then a palate cleanser like sorbet. Then roasted game birds, pheasant or partridge. Then a salad. Then savoury, something like cheese straws or anchovy toast. Then multiple desserts, puddings, tarts, jellies, ices. Then fruit and nuts. Then coffee or tea. Then chocolates or bonbons. Each course came with its own designated wine. By the end of the meal, you'd consumed 6 or 7 different beverages. And remember, you're doing all of this while wearing a corset laced tight enough that you can barely breathe, let alone digest an £8 meal. But wait, there's more. You're not just eating, you're also conversing. And Victorian dinner conversation had its own elaborate rules. You spoke to the person on your right during the first course, then a signal from the hostess, sometimes a subtle nod, sometimes a deliberate turn of her head. All the ladies would simultaneously turn to speak to the person on their left. This was called turning the table, and it ensured that no guest was left talking to the same person all evening. Your conversation had to be light, entertaining, but not too clever or too dull. You couldn't discuss politics, religion, money, illness, or death. You couldn't gossip too obviously, though veiled references to scandalous behaviour were acceptable if done with sufficient subtlety. You couldn't monopolise the conversation, but you also couldn't be silent and boring. You had to hit this perfect balance of being interesting enough to be invited back, but not so interesting that you made anyone uncomfortable or threatened anyone's ego. Men had slightly more freedom in their conversation topics, but women? We were expected to be decorative, pleasant, agreeable. One etiquette book from 1879 advised women to avoid clever remarks that might make gentlemen feel intellectually inadequate. Yes, really, you were supposed to dumb yourself down so the men wouldn't feel bad. And all of this, the eating, the drinking, the conversing, is happening while you're hyper-aware of being watched and judged by every other person at that table. Victorian dinner parties were performance art. Every gesture was scrutinised. The way you held your fork, the way you brought food to your mouth, whether you left food on your plate or finished everything, whether you drank too much wine or too little, whether you laughed too loudly or seemed too reserved. There's a story from the memoirs of Lady Randolph Churchill, Winston Churchill's American-born mother, about a dinner party she attended in the 1880s. She accidentally used her fish fork for the meat course. Just that simple mistake using the wrong fork. The hostess noticed, other guests noticed. For the rest of the evening, conversations around her seemed somehow pointed, slightly mocking. She wasn't invited to that house again for over a year. One fork, one mistake. A year of social consequence. Now, let's talk about the servants. Victorian dinner parties required an army of staff working invisibly to make everything appear effortless. In the kitchen, cooks and their assistants were preparing all those courses simultaneously, timing everything perfectly so each dish arrived at the ideal temperature. In the dining room, footmen served each course, clearing plates, refilling glasses, all while trying to be as unobtrusive as possible. The servants had their own strict hierarchy and their own rules. They weren't supposed to make eye contact with the guests. They weren't supposed to speak unless spoken to. They moved around the table in a specific pattern, serving from the left, removing from the right. They anticipated needs before guests even realized they had them. It was choreographed, rehearsed, and utterly exhausting for everyone involved. But here's where the poison comes back into our story. Remember those elaborate centerpieces I mentioned? Many of them incorporated artificial flowers and foliage. And what were artificial flowers often made from? Arsenic-dyed silk and paper. So there you are, eating your multiple courses, and sitting right in the middle of the table is a decorative arrangement slowly releasing arsenic particles into the air you're breathing as you dine. Some centerpieces also included taxidermied birds, exotic species arranged in artistic displays. Those birds were preserved using arsenic compounds. You're eating dinner next to poisoned corpses, basically, though nobody thought anything of it because that's just what fashionable table decorations looked like. The candles that provided lighting also posed hazards. They were made of tallow or beeswax, and they dripped. Sometimes hot wax would fall dangerously close to your elaborate hairstyle or your silk gown. Occasionally a candle would set a decoration or a guest's clothing on fire. Dinner parties had actual fire emergencies with surprising regularity. though of course everyone would pretend nothing happened and continue eating as if a small blaze at the buffet table was perfectly normal. And then there were the food safety issues that nobody understood yet. Victorians had no concept of bacteria or food poisoning in the modern sense. Dishes sat out at room temperature for hours. Mayonnaise-based sauces were prepared in advance and left unrefrigerated. Fish and seafood were transported without proper cooling. Shellfish poisoning was common enough that many people just accepted occasional violent illness as a normal consequence of dining out. The wealthy actually fared worse in some ways because they could afford exotic imported foods that had travelled long distances without refrigeration. There are records of entire dinner parties where all the guests fell ill from contaminated oysters or spoiled pâté. But discussing it afterward would be vulgar, so everyone just quietly suffered and hoped the hostess's reputation wouldn't be permanently damaged by accidentally poisoning her guests. The duration of these dinners is worth noting too. A formal Victorian dinner party lasted a minimum of 3 hours, often 4 or 5. You arrived at 7. You might not leave until midnight. 5 hours of performing perfect etiquette. 5 hours of restrictive clothing, 5 hours of careful conversation and strategic socializing, 5 hours of eating while trying to look like you're barely eating because ladies with big appetites were considered unfeminine. And after dinner, the ladies and gentlemen separated. The men retired to the smoking room for cigars, brandy, and the political and business discussions they couldn't have in front of women. The ladies went back to the drawing room for coffee and more polite conversation. This separation could last another hour or more. Only then would the sexes reunite, perhaps for music or cards, before finally you could make your excuses and go home. But your work isn't done yet. The next day you must send a thank you note to your hostess, not an email, not a text message, a handwritten note on appropriate stationery delivered by your maid or through the post. The note must strike the right tone, grateful but not obsequious, warm but not overly familiar. You must specifically mention something you enjoyed about the evening to prove you were paying attention. This note is required. Skip it and you might not be invited back. Think about what I've just described. Think about the sheer amount of mental energy required to navigate a single dinner party. You had to know the social hierarchy, the seating arrangements, the utensil rules, the conversation topics, the proper way to eat each type of food, the timing of each course, when to turn and speak to a different dinner partner, how to signal servants without speaking to them directly, when to laugh and when to stay serious, what to wear, how to behave, what to say and what never to mention, and you had to make it all look effortless. You had to appear graceful, natural, at ease. Because if you looked stressed or confused, if you appeared to be trying too hard, that was almost as bad as making an actual mistake. The ideal was to glide through the evening as if navigating all these complex rules was as natural as breathing. Do you know what this reminds me of? It reminds me of that anxiety dream where you show up to take a test you didn't study for, except you're also naked, and the classroom keeps shifting into different configurations. That feeling of being judged on criteria you don't fully understand, of being one wrong move away from humiliation, of performing constantly without any chance to relax. That was just Tuesday night dinner for Victorian elite women. The psychological toll must have been enormous. Some women developed what we'd now recognize as social anxiety so severe they became recluses, turning down invitations, pleading illness, gradually withdrawing from society altogether. Of course, becoming a recluse brought its own social consequences. People gossiped. They speculated about what was wrong with you. You were marked as odd, as not quite right, as someone who couldn't handle the demands of proper society. Other women became perfectionists, obsessing over every detail, practicing their dinner conversation in advance, rehearsing their etiquette until it became second nature. They passed this perfectionism onto their daughters, training the next generation to perform the same exhausting social choreography. And some women, I imagine, just went through the motions with a kind of numb resignation, following the rules because they had no choice, going to dinners they didn't enjoy with people they didn't particularly like, eating food they couldn't taste because their corsets were too tight, making conversation they didn't care about, all while pretending this was the height of civilized living, the pinnacle of human social achievement. Because that's what Victorian society told them it was. They were told they were lucky to attend these glittering dinners, privileged to sit at these elaborate tables, honoured to participate in this refined social world. The subtext was clear. If you didn't appreciate your good fortune, if you found it exhausting or stressful or meaningless, then something was wrong with you, not with the system. But I wonder how many women, lying awake at night after another lengthy dinner party staring at their bedroom ceilings, thought to themselves, there has to be more to life than this. There has to be something beyond forks and calling cards and performing propriety for an audience that's waiting for me to fail. Some did more than wonder. Some started to question, to push back, to imagine alternatives. But before we meet those rebels, we need to understand one more piece of this puzzle. Because all that performing, all that restriction, all that stress, it had physical consequences that Victorian doctors completely misunderstood, and those misunderstandings led to treatments that were worse than the diseases they claimed to cure. We're about to enter the world of Victorian medicine and its particular obsession with diagnosing, treating and controlling the female body in ways that are genuinely shocking. There's this image we all have, isn't there? The Victorian lady in her beautiful gown suddenly overcome, pressing the back of her hand to her forehead, swaying gracefully and collapsing into the arms of a concerned gentleman. She's delicate, fragile, too pure and refined for this harsh world. Someone rushes to fetch her smelling salts, those little bottles of ammonia compounds that every proper lady carried in her reticule. She inhales the sharp fumes, her eyes flutter open, and she apologizes sweetly for causing such a fuss. It's romantic, it's feminine, it's complete nonsense. Victorian women didn't faint because they were delicate flowers too refined for reality. They fainted because they literally couldn't breathe, couldn't digest food, and were being slowly poisoned by everything they wore and touched. The fainting epidemic of the Victorian era wasn't a charming character trait. It was a medical crisis caused entirely by the society that claimed to protect and cherish these women. Let me break down exactly why Victorian women were collapsing left and right. Because once you understand the physiology, you'll realize these women weren't weak. They were incredibly strong to survive what they were being put through. First, let's talk about oxygen deprivation. Remember those corsets we discussed earlier? When you lace a corset tight enough to reduce your waist by 10 to 14 inches, your lungs literally cannot expand fully. A normal breath requires your diaphragm to contract downward and your rib cage to expand outward. But a tightly laced corset prevents both of these movements. Your ribs are held rigid. Your diaphragm has nowhere to go because your internal organs are already compressed into the limited space below it. So what happens? You're forced to take shallow breaths using only the top portion of your lungs. You're getting maybe 60 to 70% of the oxygen you actually need. And you're doing this all day, every day, from the moment you wake up until you finally unlace at bedtime. Now add physical activity. You're not just sitting still in your corset, you're climbing stairs in a heavy dress, walking through rooms, standing for long periods during social calls, dancing at balls, and your muscles need oxygen to function. Your brain needs oxygen to think clearly, but you can't get enough oxygen because your respiratory system is being mechanically prevented from working properly. The result? Dizziness, lightheadedness, and eventually, if your oxygen levels drop low enough, you faint. Your body basically forces you to lie down horizontally so blood can reach your brain more easily. Fainting isn't weakness, it's your survival instinct kicking in. But wait, it gets worse, because Victorian elite women weren't just oxygen deprived, they were also nutritionally deprived. The beauty ideal of the era demanded a tiny waist and a delicate, ethereal appearance. Hearty appetites were considered unfeminine and coarse. So from adolescence onward, women were encouraged to eat like birds, tiny portions, bland foods, nothing too rich or too filling. At the same time, they were expected to maintain enormous energy levels. Managing a household, fulfilling social obligations, bearing and raising children, these activities require calories, protein, vitamins, minerals. But many elite women were consuming maybe 1,200 to 1,500 calories a day when they probably needed at least 2,000. They were chronically undernourished, which meant chronic fatigue, weakness, and yes, fainting. An 1878 medical journal article documented that elite women commonly skipped breakfast entirely, or ate only dry toast and weak tea. The doctor who wrote the article noted that these same women then complained of feeling faint by mid-morning. He seemed genuinely puzzled by this connection. We would call this an eating disorder today. They called it proper feminine delicacy. And here's something darkly funny. Victorian doctors would sometimes prescribe tonics and supplements to treat the weakness and fainting caused by malnutrition. But they never suggested that maybe, just maybe, women should eat more food. That would have been seen as encouraging unladylike gluttony. Better to give them iron pills and beef tea than to challenge the beauty standards that were slowly starving them. Now, let's add heat exhaustion to the mix. Count up the layers a Victorian elite woman wore. Chemise, drawers, at least one petticoat, often 3 to 5 petticoats, the corset cover, the crinoline or bustle frame, the dress itself with its multiple layers of fabric, and often a jacket or cape on top. In summer, in rooms heated by fireplaces, at crowded parties where hundreds of bodies were generating additional heat. The human body regulates temperature through sweating. But Victorian women's bodies were wrapped in so many layers of fabric that sweat couldn't evaporate effectively. They were essentially wearing insulation, trapping heat against their skin. Add the physical exertion of dancing or even just standing and moving around in all that weight, and body temperatures would climb dangerously high. Heat exhaustion causes dizziness, nausea, weakness, and fainting. And Victorian women were basically creating heat exhaustion conditions for themselves every time they got dressed. Ballrooms were notorious fainting zones. The combination of heat, tight corsets, malnutrition, and physical exertion meant that it was completely normal for several women to collapse during any large social event. Hosts would designate specific rooms as recovery spaces where fainted women could be taken to rest. Let me tell you about a ball that took place in London in 1863. Over 300 guests attended. The newspapers reported that 17 women fainted during the course of the evening. 17. That's more than 5% of the female guests. And this wasn't considered scandalous or unusual. The newspaper simply noted it as a fact the same way they'd note the menu or the flower arrangements. Fainting was just part of the expected social landscape. But here's where the arsenic poisoning enters the picture again. We talked about arsenic in dyes earlier, but I need to emphasize just how pervasive arsenic was in Victorian life. It wasn't just in green dresses, it was in wallpapers. Especially popular were elaborate flocked papers that could contain up to several 100 milligrams of arsenic per square foot. It was in candles, in artificial flowers, in cosmetics, in soaps, in medicinal powders that doctors prescribe for various ailments. Chronic arsenic exposure causes a host of symptoms: headaches, nausea, stomach pain, muscle weakness, dizziness, confusion, Notice anything familiar? These are also the symptoms that Victorian women were constantly experiencing and attributing to their delicate feminine constitutions. There's a documented case from 1879 of an entire family, Lord and Lady Pembroke and their 3 daughters, who all developed mysterious illness symptoms over the course of several months. They felt constantly tired, nauseous, weak. The daughters fainted frequently. Doctors were baffled. Finally, someone thought to examine their bedroom wallpapers, which were a fashionable green flocked design. The wallpaper was tested and found to contain massive amounts of arsenic. When they redecorated with arsenic-free paper, the family's symptoms disappeared within weeks. How many Victorian women were fainting not because of corsets or heat, but because they were literally being poisoned by their own bedrooms? We'll never know, because doctors at the time rarely made these connections. They were much more likely to diagnose women with hysteria or nervous complaints than to investigate environmental toxins. Speaking of which, let's talk about what Victorian society thought was causing all this fainting. The prevailing medical theory was that women were simply constitutionally weaker than men. The medical establishment genuinely believed, that women's reproductive systems made them inherently fragile and prone to nervous disorders. One prominent physician, Dr. Edward Clarke, published a book in 1873 arguing that women couldn't handle higher education because the mental effort would divert blood flow away from their reproductive organs, causing them to become sterile and sickly. Yes, really. He thought thinking too hard would break women's wombs. And this wasn't some fringe quack. This was a respected Harvard Medical School professor, and his book became a bestseller. It was used for decades to argue against women's education and professional advancement. So when women fainted, doctors didn't look at the corsets, the arsenic, the malnutrition, the heat exhaustion, or the sheer stress of performing perfect femininity every waking moment. Instead, they diagnosed hysteria, or neurasthenia, or nervous prostration, vague terms that basically meant being female is making you sick. The smelling salts that Victorian women carried weren't actually a treatment, they were more like a temporary reboot. Smelling salts contain ammonia or ammonium carbonate, which creates a sharp, unpleasant smell that causes an involuntary inhalation reflex. This sudden sharp breath brings more oxygen to the brain and often revives someone who's fainted. But it doesn't address any of the underlying causes. It's like using jumper cables on a car with no gas. Sure, it might start, but it's not going to run for long. And yet smelling salts became such a ubiquitous accessory that they were sold in decorative bottles, often beautifully designed with silver or enamel, small enough to fit in a lady's handbag or attach to her chatelaine. That's the chain of useful items women wore at their waists, like a Victorian version of a utility belt. Having ornate smelling salts was fashionable. It signalled that you were the kind of refined lady who might need to be revived at any moment because you were so delicate and sensitive. There's something deeply sad about that, don't you think? Women were so consistently oxygen deprived, malnourished and poisoned that they literally carried revival equipment as a fashion accessory. And instead of recognising this as a crisis, society romanticised it. Fainting became part of feminine mystique. Let me read you something from an 1868 etiquette manual. It instructed young women on how to faint properly. I am not making this up. There were instructions on appropriate fainting technique. The book advised, if you feel faintness coming upon you in company, attempt to reach a chair or sofa before you fall. Sinking gracefully shows breeding. A lady should never fall heavily or suddenly. Even in loss of consciousness, she should exhibit delicacy. Even unconsciousness was supposed to be performed correctly. Even a medical emergency was supposed to maintain social grace. The pressure never ended, not even when your body was literally shutting down from lack of oxygen. But here's what really gets me. Men didn't faint. Victorian men wore multiple layers too: shirts, waistcoats, jackets, sometimes overcoats. They worked in heated offices. They attended the same crowded parties, but they weren't collapsing left and right. Why? Because they weren't wearing corsets. They weren't malnourished. They weren't being poisoned by their clothes as systematically. They were allowed to eat proper meals, to breathe fully, to move freely. The differential fainting rates between men and women weren't evidence of women's biological inferiority. They were evidence of what society was doing to women's bodies. But Victorian culture couldn't or wouldn't see it that way. Instead, they used women's fainting as proof that women were naturally fragile and needed male protection and guidance. It's such a perfect circular logic, isn't it? Restrict women's breathing, movement, and nutrition, then use their resulting physical weakness as justification for restricting them further because they're clearly too delicate to handle freedom or responsibility. The oppression creates the symptoms, then the symptoms are used to justify the oppression. Some women understood this, by the way. There were voices, even in the Victorian era, pointing out these connections. Dress reform advocates argued that corsets were causing the very weakness they were supposed to remedy. Health reformers published articles showing that women who didn't tight lace and who ate proper diets didn't faint nearly as often. But these reformers were dismissed as radicals, as unfeminine, as threats to proper society. The feminist writer Frances Power Cobbe wrote in 1868, "We lace our daughters' waists until they cannot breathe, then express surprise that they are too weak for intellectual pursuits. We starve them until they can barely climb a staircase, then declare them unfit for any profession requiring stamina. We poison them with our fashion, then claim their sickness proves their inferiority. The wonder is not that women faint, the wonder is that they survive at all." Frances Power Cobbe was viciously criticised for that statement. She was called unladylike, hysterical, and unwomanly. But she was right. Victorian women weren't surviving despite their delicacy. They were surviving despite everything society was doing to harm them. And I want you to think about this the next time you see a costume drama where a woman faints prettily into someone's arms and everyone treats it as a charming quirk. That wasn't charm. That was suffering. That was a body shutting down because it couldn't sustain the demands being placed on it. That was a woman paying the physical price for conforming to impossible beauty standards and social expectations. The fainting epidemic finally started to decline in the late 1890s and early 1900s, when dress reform movements gained ground, when corsets became less extreme, when arsenic dyes were gradually phased out due to public health concerns. As women's clothing became less restrictive and less toxic, they miraculously stopped fainting as much. Funny how that works. But before Victorian women could benefit from dress reform, many suffered terribly, and when they sought medical help for their weakness, fainting, and mysterious illnesses, they encountered a medical establishment that was ready to diagnose them with mental disorders and subject them to treatments that were often worse than the symptoms. The doctors were coming and they had very specific ideas about what was wrong with the female mind and body. None of those ideas were good, and the cures they proposed were genuinely horrifying. So you're exhausted, you faint frequently, you feel anxious and trapped, you're frustrated by the limitations placed on your life. You want something more than endless social calls and needlework. You've mentioned to your husband that you'd like to study languages or perhaps write something for publication. You've expressed that you're bored, unfulfilled, that the constant performance of perfect femininity is wearing you down. Your husband, concerned for your well-being, consults a physician, and that physician has a diagnosis ready before you even walk through his office door. You're suffering from hysteria, or perhaps neurasthenia, maybe nervous prostration. The specific term doesn't really matter, because they all mean essentially the same thing. You're a woman, and there's something wrong with you. Welcome to Victorian medical practice, where being female was considered a pre-existing condition, and wanting anything beyond your prescribed role was classified as mental illness. The diagnosis of hysteria has a long, dark history stretching back to ancient Greece, but Victorian doctors took it to new heights, or depths, depending on your perspective. The word hysteria comes from the Greek word for uterus, because ancient physicians believed the condition was caused by a wandering womb moving around the body causing mischief. By the Victorian era, doctors had abandoned the wandering womb theory, but they'd replaced it with something almost as ridiculous: the belief that women's reproductive systems made them inherently unstable, irrational, and prone to mental and physical disorders. And the symptoms of hysteria? Oh, they were beautifully vague and all-encompassing. An 1859 physician named Robert Carter published a book listing over 75 possible symptoms of hysteria. Let me read you some of them: faintness, nervousness, insomnia, fluid retention, muscle spasms, shortness of breath, irritability, loss of appetite, excessive appetite, sexual desire, lack of sexual desire, tendency to cause trouble, and my personal favourite, a fondness for writing. Yes, wanting to write was considered a symptom of mental illness in women. So was being too passionate about anything, whether it was art, politics, reform causes, or religion. Basically, any strong feeling or intense interest could get you diagnosed with hysteria. And once you had that diagnosis, your life could become infinitely worse than it already was. One physician claimed in 1859 that over 1/4 of all women suffered from hysteria. 1/4. Think about that statistic for a moment. Either Victorian women were genuinely experiencing an epidemic of mental illness, or, and stay with me here, the definition of mental illness was being applied to normal human responses to an abnormal situation. If you're trapped in a suffocating social system, dressed in clothing that damages your body, denied education and meaningful work, treated as property rather than as a person, and you respond with frustration, anxiety, or depression, is that mental illness, or is that a completely rational response to oppression? Victorian doctors chose option 1. They decided women were crazy, not that society was making them that way. The treatments these doctors prescribed ranged from useless to actively harmful, and I need to tell you about them because they reveal so much about how Victorian medicine viewed women, not as patients to be helped, but as problems to be controlled. Let's start with the rest cure, developed by an American neurologist named Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell in 1874. Mitchell initially developed this treatment for soldiers suffering from what we'd now call post-traumatic stress disorder after the Civil War, but he quickly decided it was perfect for treating hysterical women, and it became the go-to treatment for female nervous disorders for the next 50 years. Here's how the rest cure worked. The patient, let's call her Catherine, a young woman who's expressed unhappiness with her marriage and mentioned wanting to study at university, is prescribed 6 to 8 weeks of complete bed rest. Not just staying in bed when she's tired, but mandatory confinement to bed 24 hours a day. She's not allowed to sit up, she's not allowed to leave her room, she's not allowed to have visitors except for her doctor and perhaps her husband. She's forbidden from doing any intellectual or creative activities. No reading books, especially not novels which were thought to overstimulate the female brain. No writing letters, no sewing or embroidery, no drawing or painting, nothing that might engage her mind. She's supposed to lie there in enforced idleness, staring at the walls for 6 to 8 weeks straight. At the same time, she's put on a high-fat, high-calorie diet, lots of milk and meat. The goal is to make her gain significant weight because Dr. Mitchell believed that heavier women were more docile, more content with domestic life, less likely to have dangerous intellectual ambitions. He wrote in his book Fat and Blood, published in 1877, that his goal was to make women, as a mother more capable, as a wife more helpful. Notice he didn't say as a person more healthy or as an individual more fulfilled. The point was to make her a better servant to her family, not to actually improve her well-being. If she refused to eat, she was force-fed. Sometimes the doctor would do this himself, holding her nose until she had to open her mouth to breathe, then shoving food in. Sometimes nurses or family members were instructed to force-feed her. The humiliation and violation of this was, of course, part of the treatment. It taught women that their bodies didn't belong to them. That resistance was futile, that they had no right to autonomy even over what went into their own mouths. The only physical activity allowed during the rescue was massage and something called electrotherapy. Doctors would apply electrical stimulation to the patient's muscles to prevent atrophy from the prolonged bed rest. These electrical devices were early, crude versions of modern TENS units, but they were often painful and frightening. The treatment that was supposedly helping her was actually creating new trauma. Now you might be thinking, surely some women benefited from rest after years of exhausting social obligations and physical restriction. And yes, initially, some women probably did feel better simply from being allowed to lie down and not perform for a while. But 6 to 8 weeks of sensory deprivation, intellectual starvation, and forced feeding, that doesn't heal anyone. That breaks them down. Dr. Mitchell explicitly compared his treatment to solitary confinement in prisons. He wrote that the point was to break up the whole daily drama of the sick room with its selfishness and its craving for sympathy. He called hysterical women vampires who suck the blood of healthy people around them. This was a doctor supposedly dedicated to healing, describing his patients as parasitic monsters who needed to be isolated and controlled. The most famous account of the rest cure comes from Charlotte Perkins Gilman, a writer and women's rights advocate. In 1886, shortly after the birth of her daughter, Charlotte suffered from what we'd now recognize as postpartum depression. She felt, in her words, utter prostration and unbearable inner misery with ceaseless tears. Her husband sent her to Dr. Mitchell for treatment. Mitchell prescribed the rest cure. For weeks, Charlotte was confined to bed, forbidden to write or read, forced to be passive and helpless. She later wrote that the treatment brought her so near the borderline of utter mental ruin that I could see over. When she couldn't take it anymore, she abandoned the treatment and eventually left her husband, moving across the country to California, where she built a successful career as a writer and lecturer. In 1892, she wrote The Yellow Wallpaper, a short story about a woman undergoing the rest cure who gradually descends into madness while staring at the wallpaper in her sick room. The story is genuinely disturbing. The narrator becomes convinced that there's a woman trapped behind the wallpaper, and by the end she's crawling around the room, having lost her grip on reality. Charlotte sent a copy to Dr. Mitchell with a note explaining that she had written it to expose the damaging effects of his treatment. He never responded, though some accounts suggest he quietly stopped prescribing the rest cure quite as often after reading it. But the rest cure was far from the only disturbing treatment available for hysterical women. Let's talk about surgical interventions, because Victorian doctors were absolutely convinced that women's mental problems were rooted in their reproductive organs, and if talking cures and rest cures didn't work, well, why not just remove the problematic organs entirely? Ovariotomies, surgical removal of the ovaries, became a fashionable treatment for hysteria, neurasthenia, and basically any female complaint in the late 1800s. Dr. Robert Batty of Georgia pioneered this procedure in the 1870s, initially for genuine medical conditions like ovarian tumours, but he and other surgeons quickly expanded the indications to include menstrual madness, nymphomania, excessive masturbation, and generic insanity in women. Let me be very clear about what we're discussing here. Doctors were performing major abdominal surgery without proper anaesthesia in many cases, since anaesthesia was still new and not always trusted, to remove healthy organs from women whose only symptoms were things like wanting sexual satisfaction in their marriages, expressing political opinions, or being inconveniently assertive. One particularly disturbing case from the London Asylum in Ontario, Canada, involved Dr. Richard Morris Bucker, who became superintendent in 1877. Dr. Buck was convinced that insanity in women was caused by diseased reproductive organs. He performed numerous gynecological surgeries on his female patients, including hysterectomies, ovariotomies, and clitoridectomies. Yes, female genital mutilation performed in a Canadian mental hospital in the 1880s by a respected physician who was trying to cure madness. How many of these women were actually mentally ill by any reasonable standard? How many were simply inconvenient, rebellious, or traumatized by abuse and mistreatment? We'll never know, but we do know that the mortality rate for these surgeries was high, the suffering was immense, and the cures were non-existent. Women who survived the operations often develop chronic pain, infections, and genuine mental distress from the trauma of what had been done to them. And here's the cruelest irony. If a woman became more depressed or anxious after having her ovaries removed, that was taken as evidence that she needed even more aggressive treatment. Her worsening condition proved she was truly insane, not that the treatment itself was harmful. The medical establishment had created a perfect closed system where women couldn't win. Resist treatment and you're clearly too sick to make your own decisions. Submit to treatment and get worse, and you're clearly even sicker than initially diagnosed. For women who wouldn't or couldn't access medical care, there were the asylums. Victorian mental institutions warehoused thousands of women, many of whom had no mental illness in the modern sense. They were there because they'd had affairs or wanted divorces, or inherited money that male relatives wanted to control, or simply made powerful men angry. The reasons women were committed to asylums would be darkly comical if they weren't so tragic. Hospital records from the era show women admitted for novel reading, religious enthusiasm, bad company, laziness, egotism, and imaginary female trouble. One woman was committed for political excitement during the Civil War, another for suppressed menstruation, another for jealousy and religion. These weren't medical diagnoses. These were excuses to imprison women who challenge social norms or inconvenience their families. Once inside an asylum, women face treatments that make the rescuer look gentle. Cold water baths where patients were plunged into icy water as shock treatment. Rotational therapy where patients were strapped to spinning chairs until they vomited and lost consciousness. Physical restraints that kept women tied to beds or chairs for hours or days. And of course the enforced idleness, the isolation from family and friends, the loss of all autonomy and dignity. Some women spent decades in asylums for crimes, like being too educated, too outspoken, or too unhappy in their marriages. The playwright and actress Zelda Fitzgerald, yes, Mr. Scott Fitzgerald's wife, spent much of her later life in mental institutions diagnosed with schizophrenia. Modern analysis of her case suggests she was actually suffering from bipolar disorder, possibly exacerbated by the stress of her husband's alcoholism and emotional abuse. But in her era, her creativity, her ambition, her desire to be more than just a famous man's wife, those were seen as symptoms of madness. Now, I don't want to suggest that no Victorian women had genuine mental illness that deserved compassionate treatment. Of course some did. Depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, these conditions have always existed and have always caused real suffering. The problem wasn't that Victorian doctors treated mental illness. The problem was how they defined it, how they understood its causes, and how they treated it. They saw mental illness in women as fundamentally different from mental illness in men. When men were depressed or anxious, it was often attributed to business stress, financial worries, the burdens of responsibility, external causes that made sense and commanded sympathy. When women were depressed or anxious, it was attributed to their wombs, their ovaries, their inherent female weakness, internal biological flaws that made them inferior and required control. This double standard extended to treatment. Men with nervous disorders might be sent on restorative travels, given lighter work duties, prescribed tonics and fresh air. Women with nervous disorders were confined, restricted, sometimes operated on, always blamed for their own suffering. And the medical profession reinforced these gender hierarchies while claiming to be scientific and objective. Doctors published papers in respected journals arguing that women's brains were smaller and less capable than men's brains, that education damaged women's health, that professional work would make women sterile, that any deviation from traditional feminine roles would cause physical and mental collapse. These weren't fringe opinions. These were mainstream medical views taught in universities and practiced in hospitals. The damage this did to individual women suffering under these treatments, to women's collective advancement, to our cultural understanding of gender and mental health, is incalculable. But here's something important. Women noticed. They talked to each other. They compared experience. They began to question whether maybe, just maybe, the problem wasn't their bodies or their minds, but the system they were trapped in. And some of them started to push back, to demand change, to imagine a different world where women could exist fully without being pathologized, punished, or put away. Those women are the rebels we need to meet. But before we get to them, there's one more piece of the Victorian woman's experience we need to understand. Because if you thought social expectations, deadly fashion, and medical abuse were bad, wait until we talk about the institution of marriage, the trap that every elite Victorian girl was trained from birth to enter, and from which there was almost no escape once the vows were spoken. The marriage market was waiting, and it treated women exactly like what the name suggests: commodities to be bought, sold and owned. Every Victorian girl grew up knowing one fundamental truth. Her entire worth would be determined by who she married, not by her intelligence, her talents, her kindness, or her dreams, by her husband, by the man whose property she would legally become on her wedding day. This wasn't romantic courtship. This was a transaction, and the currency being traded was women themselves. Let me walk you through the marriage market from start to finish, because I think understanding this system is crucial to understanding why Victorian women were so thoroughly trapped. It starts earlier than you might think, around age 16 or 17, when a girl officially came out into society through a ritual called the debutante presentation. If you were the daughter of an aristocratic or wealthy family, your coming out meant being formally presented to the Queen at court. This happened at St. James's Palace in London, and it was an elaborate ceremony that required months of preparation. Your mother would spend a small fortune on your presentation gown, white or pale-coloured, with specific requirements about train length, feather arrangements, and veil styling. The rules were exacting. Your train had to be exactly 3 yards long. You had to wear 3 white ostrich feathers in your hair, positioned just so. You had to wear a veil, but it couldn't cover your face. On the day of your presentation, you'd arrive at the palace with dozens of other debutantes and their families. You'd wait for hours in anterooms, your stomach churning with nervousness, trying not to wrinkle your gown or disturb your elaborate hairstyle. When your name was finally called, you'd walk into the throne room, approach the Queen, execute a perfect curtsy, deep enough to show respect but not so deep that you'd fall over in your restrictive dress, and then back out of the royal presence without turning around, because turning your back on the Queen was unthinkable. This presentation meant you were now officially out in society. You were on the market, you were available for marriage negotiations, and the clock started ticking immediately, because every year you remained unmarried decreased your value as a commodity. The social season ran from April to August, timed around when Parliament was in session so all the important families would be in London. During these months there was an exhausting calendar of balls, dinners, opera performances, garden parties and races at Ascot. Every event was an opportunity to see and be seen, to display your daughter's charms to potential suitors, to begin the delicate negotiations that might lead to an engagement. And let me be clear, these were negotiations in the most literal sense. Marriages among the elite were business arrangements. Yes, there might be some consideration for mutual compatibility or affection, but the primary factors were money, property, social position, and family alliances. Love was a pleasant bonus, not a requirement. The most desirable brides were those who brought substantial dowries, money or property that would become their husbands upon marriage. An 1882 article in a society magazine noted that the going rate for a prestigious marriage was roughly £10,000, which in today's money would be over $1 million. That's how much a family might expect to pay to secure a titled son-in-law for their daughter. But wait, you might be thinking, didn't rich families want their daughters to marry rich men? Why would they need to provide a dowry? Here's the economic logic. Titled aristocratic families often had land and prestige, but were short on liquid cash. Their estates might be enormous but unprofitable, burdened with debt, expensive to maintain. Meanwhile, industrial families had made fortunes in manufacturing, railways or trade, but lacked social status. So a deal would be made. The industrial family's daughter brought money, the aristocratic son brought a title. She became Lady Somebody, gaining social prestige. He got an injection of cash to save his crumbling estate. Everyone wins, except maybe the bride and groom, who might not even like each other. These marriage negotiations were handled by the parents, primarily the fathers. The young people involved had very little say. There's a famous quote from Lady Dorothy Neville, a Victorian socialite who wrote in her memoirs, "In my day, girls had about as much say in their marriages as a piece of furniture. We were moved from our father's house to our husband's house, and our opinions on the matter were neither sought nor valued." Think about what that means. At 18 or 19 years old, you're essentially sold to a man you barely know. You might have danced with him twice at balls. You might have had a few chaperoned conversations in drawing rooms, but you haven't spent real time with him. You don't know his temper, his habits, his character. You don't know if he's kind or cruel, patient or volatile, faithful or likely to keep mistresses, and you have no way to find out before you're legally bound to him for life. Because divorce was nearly impossible. The first Divorce Act wasn't passed until 1857, and even then, the standards were wildly unequal. A husband could divorce his wife for adultery alone, but a wife had to prove adultery plus another serious offence: cruelty, desertion, incest, or bigamy. Just adultery wasn't enough, and the social stigma attached to divorced women was devastating. They were shunned, excluded from polite society, often cut off from their own children, and most women, even in miserable marriages, stayed. Let me tell you about the legal doctrine of coverture, because this is fundamental to understanding why marriage was such a trap. Under coverture law, which remained in effect throughout most of the Victorian era, a married woman had no legal existence separate from her husband. This wasn't metaphorical, this was literal law. The legal term was femme couverte, a covered woman. Her identity was covered by her husband's. Here's what this meant in practice. When you married, all your property, everything you owned, everything you would inherit, all your personal possessions became your husband's. If you owned a house before marriage, it was now his. If you received an inheritance, it was his. If you earned money through work or writing or any other means, it was his. You couldn't sign contracts. You couldn't sue or be sued. You couldn't make a will. You couldn't keep custody of your own children if your husband decided to take them away. An 1868 essay by a legal reformer described a married woman's status as more disadvantaged than a criminal or a lunatic, for they at least retain ownership of their property. That's not exaggeration. That's legal reality. Convicted felons had more property rights than married women. Let's follow one woman's story to see how this played out. Her name was Caroline Norton, and her case became famous in the 1830s and 40s, helping eventually to change some of these laws. Caroline was a writer and socialite who made a disastrous marriage to George Norton, a lawyer and member of Parliament. George was abusive, controlling, and bad with money. Caroline, meanwhile, was talented and successful. She wrote novels and poetry that earned substantial income. But because of coverture, all Caroline's earnings belonged to George. He spent her money freely while physically abusing her. When Caroline finally left him in 1836, George responded by taking custody of their 3 young sons and refusing to let Caroline see them. He was legally entitled to do this. The children were his property, just as Caroline had been. Caroline couldn't divorce George because she couldn't prove adultery plus another serious offence. She couldn't support herself independently because her earnings were still legally his. She couldn't sue him for custody of her children because she had no legal standing. For years, she fought through public campaigns and political lobbying, eventually helping to pass the Infant Custody Act of 1839, which allowed separated mothers to petition for custody of children under 7. But even after that small victory, Caroline remained legally married to George Norton until his death in 1877, 41 years of being chained to a man she'd left after less than a decade of marriage. And she was one of the lucky ones. Lucky because she was well-connected, educated, able to earn money and fight back publicly. Most women in similar situations had no resources and no voice. Now let's talk about what happened inside marriages, because the reality was often grim. Marital rape wasn't recognized as a crime. The prevailing legal theory was that by marrying, a woman gave permanent consent to sexual relations with her husband. He had unlimited sexual access to her body whenever he wanted, regardless of her wishes, her health, or whether she'd just given birth a week earlier. Saying no wasn't an option. A woman was expected to submit to her husband's sexual demands as a wifely duty. Medical texts of the era explicitly instructed women that refusal of marital relations was grounds for their husbands to seek satisfaction elsewhere, and if adultery resulted, it was the wife's fault for not being sufficiently compliant. The double standard was breathtaking. Wives had to be faithful under pain of social death and potential loss of their children, while husbands' affairs were considered regrettable but understandable lapses, and contraception essentially unavailable and socially taboo. The first rubber condoms appeared in the 1850s, but they were expensive, unreliable, and many doctors argued against them, claiming they encouraged immorality. Women had almost no control over their own fertility. If your husband wanted sex and didn't want to use contraception, you got pregnant, again and again and again. Queen Victoria herself had 9 children in 17 years of marriage, despite reportedly hating pregnancy and finding it undignified. If the Queen, the most powerful woman in the empire, couldn't control her own reproductive life, what hope did ordinary women have? The result was that many Victorian elite women spent much of their adult lives either pregnant, recovering from childbirth, or nursing infants. The physical toll was enormous, especially given the dangerous nature of childbirth in the era. We'll talk more about maternal mortality later, but for now, understand that every pregnancy was a genuine risk to a woman's life, and she had virtually no ability to prevent those pregnancies beyond hoping her husband would show restraint. Some marriages were, of course, happy, or at least tolerable. There are love letters between Victorian spouses that show genuine affection and partnership, but even in happy marriages the power imbalance was stark. A kind husband might consult his wife's opinions and consider her wishes. A cruel husband could do literally whatever he wanted, and his wife had no recourse. The quality of a woman's married life depended entirely on the character of the man she'd been sold to, and she had almost no way to know what that character was before the wedding. Let me read you something from an 1845 household management guide written for brides. It advised, "A wife should submit gracefully to her husband's will in all matters. If he corrects her, she should accept it with gratitude, understanding that his guidance makes her a better woman. If he seeks pleasures outside the home, she should examine her own failings that drove him to it. Her role is not to challenge or question, but to support and obey." This was the ideal that young women were taught to aspire to. Not partnership, not mutual respect, submission and obedience. And if your husband mistreated you, well, you probably deserved it somehow. The system was designed to make women blame themselves for their own oppression. Now you might wonder, didn't any women just choose not to marry? Yes, some did. But spinsterhood, remaining unmarried past your mid-20s, came with its own set of problems. Unmarried women were objects of pity and mockery. They were called old maids and treated as failed women who couldn't attract a husband. Practically speaking, spinsters had limited options. They couldn't live independently. A woman living alone was considered scandalous. So they typically remained in their father's household, treated as permanent children regardless of their age. When their father died, they might become dependent on brothers or other male relatives, or they might become governesses or companions, socially ambiguous positions that left them neither family nor servant, belonging nowhere fully. Some women preferred spinsterhood to a bad marriage. Florence Nightingale, the famous nurse, never married, partly because she knew marriage would end her ability to pursue her work. She wrote in her diary, "I would have been happy to marry, but I could not marry with my work undone, and marriage would have made my work impossible." She chose her calling over the security of marriage, and society never quite forgave her for it. She was admired for her nursing work, but also criticized as unfeminine and unnatural for remaining single. The pressure on young women to marry was intense and came from all sides. Parents wanted their daughters settled. Society judged unmarried women as failures, and women themselves internalized these messages, feeling worthless if they couldn't attract a proposal. The entire system was designed to funnel every girl toward marriage, regardless of whether marriage was actually in her best interest. And here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. Arranged marriages weren't just an upper-class phenomenon. Working-class families also pressured daughters into marriages for economic reasons. But elite families had more resources at stake, more social capital to protect, and more elaborate systems for managing the marriage market. The balls, the presentations, the seasons, these were infrastructure for arranging suitable marriages among the wealthy. It's striking how much effort and money went into this system. Families spent fortunes on debutante presentations, season wardrobes, and entertaining. All that social calling and card-leaving we discussed earlier was ultimately about positioning daughters in the marriage market. The entire social structure of elite Victorian life revolved around successfully marrying off the next generation in ways that preserved or enhanced family wealth and status. And the girls at the centre of all this? They were commodities, yes, But they were also human beings with thoughts, feelings, desires, and dreams that had nothing to do with becoming some man's wife and property. Some accepted their fate with resignation. Some embraced it, believing the propaganda that marriage and motherhood were women's highest callings. And some rebelled, in ways small and large, refusing to accept that their only value lay in their marriageability. But rebellion came at a cost. Refuse to marry and face a life of dependency and social marginalization. Marry badly and be legally trapped with a man who might abuse, neglect, or simply bore you for the rest of your life. There were no good options, only degrees of bad ones. The golden cage of Victorian womanhood was never more apparent than in the marriage market, where women's entire lives were reduced to their ability to attract and submit to a husband. Yet even within this oppressive system, even in marriages they hadn't chosen, women found ways to create meaning, to exercise what little agency they had, to build lives that mattered. Because here's what the Victorian system underestimated: the capacity of human beings to find purpose and create value even in circumstances designed to diminish them. The work of managing elite households, which we're about to explore, wasn't the leisure that men imagined. It was labour, invisible, undervalued, exhausting labour that kept the entire social machinery running. And the women doing that labour deserved to have their work recognised for what it actually was. Here's what Victorian society told everyone about elite women. They lived lives of leisure. They had nothing to do but look pretty, attend parties and enjoy the privileges of wealth. They were decorative creatures who floated through beautiful rooms in beautiful dresses, pampered by armies of servants, free from the burdens that weighed down working women and men of all classes. Here's the reality. Elite Victorian women worked constantly. They just weren't allowed to call it work. Managing an upper-class household wasn't a hobby or a pastime. It was a full-time job requiring the organisational skills of a corporate manager, the diplomacy of a politician, the accounting abilities of a bookkeeper, and the crisis management talents of an emergency responder. But because this labour happened in the domestic sphere, because it didn't produce goods for sale or earn wages, it was invisible. It didn't count as real work. The women doing it were still classified as leisured, idle, non-productive members of society. Let me show you what a typical day actually looked like for the mistress of a large Victorian household, because I think once you see the reality, you'll understand why so many of these women were exhausted, anxious, and desperate for some acknowledgement that what they were doing mattered. You wake at 6 in the morning, an hour before your husband and children rise. This early hour is your only quiet time, and you use it to review the day's schedule, check over menus, and prepare yourself mentally for the 12 to 14 hours of management ahead. By 7, you're dressed, with your maid's assistance, of course, since your clothing is designed to require help, and ready to begin the day's work. Your first task is meeting with your housekeeper, Mrs. Henderson, a stern woman in her 50s who has worked for the family for 20 years. She presents you with the weekly accounts, money spent on groceries, coal, candles, servants' wages, repairs to the house, replacements for broken items. You must review every entry, query, any unusual expenses, approve or deny requests for additional funds. If you're managing a large townhouse plus a country estate, you might be overseeing budgets of several £100s per month, which in today's money would be like managing $50,000 or more in monthly household expenses. And here's the thing, you're not just rubber stamping these accounts, you're expected to actually understand them, to catch errors, to identify waste, to negotiate with tradespeople for better prices. One household management guide from 1861 advised that a lady must know the going rate for everything from a leg of mutton to a chimney sweeping, lest the servants and suppliers take advantage of her ignorance. So you need to be knowledgeable about market prices, seasonal availability of foods, quality standards for everything from coal to candles. You need to track inventory of household linens, know when things need replacing, budget for major expenses like redecorating or repairs. You're essentially running a small business, except businesses get financial reports and professional accountants. You just get handwritten ledgers and the expectation that you'll figure it out while also managing everything else. After the accounts meeting, you move to menu planning. In an elite household, dinner parties were frequent, and even ordinary family meals required substantial planning. You sit with your cook, Mrs. Davies, who has definite opinions about what she will and won't prepare, and discuss the week's menus. You need to balance multiple factors: what's in season, what guests are expected, what your husband prefers, dietary needs of children and any invalids in the household, budget constraints, and the cook's capabilities and temperament. Let's say you're planning a dinner party for 16 guests on Thursday. You need to design a multi-course menu that's impressive but not showy, expensive but not wasteful, fashionable but not avant-garde. You need to consider who's attending. Are there any foods they dislike or can't eat? You need to ensure courses flow logically, that flavors don't clash, that there's variety in textures and presentations, and you need to communicate all of this clearly to Mrs. Davies, who takes any criticism of her cooking very personally. This menu planning might take an hour or more, and you'll do it multiple times per week. And heaven help you if something goes wrong, if a course is overcooked or under-seasoned, if the timing is off so food arrives cold, if a guest has an allergy you didn't account for. The hostess gets blamed for any culinary failures, even though you probably can't even cook yourself because cooking is servant's work and learning it would be beneath your station. By 9 o'clock the children are up and you oversee their breakfast, then coordinate with their governess about the day's lessons. If you have 3 or 4 children of different ages, each needs individual attention. Little George needs help with his Latin vocabulary. Emma requires discipline because she's been rude to the governess. Baby Margaret needs checking on. Is her nursemaid properly attending to her? Does she seem well? You're not raising your children in the modern sense. You have nursemaids for infants, nannies for toddlers, governesses for older children, but you're still responsible for their moral and educational development, for hiring and managing their caregivers, for overseeing their progress and correcting their faults, and you're judged ruthlessly by society on how your children turn out. Badly behaved children reflect poorly on your management skills as a mother. Around 10, you're back to administrative tasks. The butler brings you a list of household issues requiring decisions. The laundry maid needs new equipment. Approve or deny. A parlour maid has asked for a half-day off to visit her sick mother. Grant permission or refuse. The footman and the under-butler are feuding about something, and it's affecting their work. Mediate the dispute. The upstairs carpet is showing wear. Repair it or replace it, and if replace, what quality and colour. Every one of these decisions requires judgment, and wrong decisions have consequences. Be too generous with staff and they'll take advantage. Be too harsh and you'll lose good servants, which means hiring and training replacements. Spend too much on household items and your husband will criticize your extravagance. Spend too little and the household's appearance will suffer, reflecting poorly on the family's status. An 1874 household management book noted that the mistress of a large establishment must possess the executive capacity of a general, for she commands troops that must be organized, disciplined, and directed toward common purpose. But unlike a general, you have no formal authority structure, no clear chain of command, no written regulations. You're managing through a complex system of social hierarchy, personal relationships, and unspoken expectations. By 11, you might have a brief moment to yourself, to read, to write letters, to do needlework, but this isn't really leisure time. Your letter writing includes substantial correspondence for your husband's political or business connections, thank you notes for recent hospitality, letters to family members, coordination with other ladies about charitable activities. One Victorian lady's diary recorded writing an average of 7 letters per day. 7, handwritten, with proper etiquette for each correspondent. At noon, you're back to household matters, time to inspect the house. You walk through every room, checking that maids have cleaned properly, that everything is in order, that no damage or wear has gone unnoticed. You might literally run your gloved finger along picture frames to check for dust. This isn't being petty. This is quality control. A well-run household reflects well on you. A slovenly one damages your reputation and your husband's standing. During your inspection, you might notice that the drawing room curtains are fading from sun exposure. Add that to the list of things to address. The silver candlesticks need polishing. Make a note to mention it to the parlour maid. There's a water stain on the ceiling of the second-floor corridor. Have the butler investigate for leaks. Your mental to-do list grows constantly. Afternoon brings social obligations. Remember all that calling and card leaving we discussed? That's work too. You spend 2 to 3 hours either receiving callers or paying calls yourself, and every interaction requires careful management. Which invitations to accept, which to decline. How to navigate social tensions, how to advance your family's interests while maintaining relationships. This is networking, though it was never called that. This is public relations, though that term didn't exist yet. One fascinating detail from an 1880 memoir. Lady Augusta Fane wrote that she kept a detailed notebook of every social interaction, including who called on whom, what was discussed, any slights or favours, upcoming events, and strategic opportunities. She reviewed this notebook before social events to ensure she didn't miss important connections or make diplomatic errors. She was essentially maintaining a social database in her head and on paper, tracking a network of hundreds of people and their complicated relationships. By evening, you're overseeing dinner service. Even if it's just family, someone needs to ensure everything runs smoothly, that the correct wines are served, that courses come out properly timed, that servants are performing their duties correctly. If you're hosting guests, you're also managing conversation, ensuring no one is left out, keeping topics appropriate, handling any social awkwardness that arises. After dinner, you finally have some time with your husband, except this is also work because you need to update him on household matters that require his approval, discuss upcoming social events, coordinate schedules, maybe deal with any problems that arose during the day. The household management book I mentioned earlier noted that a wise wife presents problems to her husband in a manner that makes him feel he is making decisions, while in reality she is gently steering him toward conclusions she has already reached. So even your marriage requires strategic management. You're not just a wife, you're a chief of staff, feeding information up the chain of command in ways that get the outcomes you need, while making your husband feel like he's in control. By 10 or 11 at night, you're exhausted. You've been working for 15 or 16 hours with perhaps 1 hour of actual rest, and you'll do it all again the next day, and the day after that, and every day for the rest of your adult life with no vacations, no days off, no retirement. Now let's talk about the servants, because managing staff was perhaps the most demanding aspect of household management. A large elite household might employ 20 to 30 servants. Butler, housekeeper, cook, several housemaids, parlour maids, ladies' maids, valets, footmen, coachman, groom, gardener, laundress, kitchen maids, scullery maids, nursery staff. That's 30 people you're responsible for managing, each with their own duties, personalities, ambitions, and problems. Victorian servants worked within a rigid hierarchy. Upper servants like the butler, housekeeper, and cook had authority over lower servants and often didn't even eat with them. There were rules about which servants could speak to which family members, which doors they could use, where they could go in the house. Learning and enforcing these hierarchies was part of your job, and servants came with drama. They had romances, feuds, ambitions, grievances. The housemaid and the footman are carrying on a flirtation that's distracting them from work. You need to address it. The cook and the housekeeper have a long-standing rivalry and keep undermining each other. You need to mediate. The new parlourmaid comes from a respectable family but has fallen on hard times, and she's humiliated by her position and taking it out on the other servants. You need to manage her emotions while maintaining discipline. One particularly challenging aspect was dealing with sexual harassment and assault. Male servants sometimes preyed on female servants, and even the master of the house or his sons might assault servants with impunity. If a maid got pregnant, she'd be dismissed, no matter that she was the victim. The mistress of the house often knew these dynamics existed but had limited power to protect vulnerable servants, especially if the predator was her own husband or son. An 1895 letter from a lady to her sister reveals this awful dynamic. She wrote, "I know that James is bothering the new scullery maid, and I have spoken to him about it, but he simply laughs and tells me I'm imagining things. If the girl falls pregnant, I shall have to dismiss her to prevent scandal, though my conscience troubles me greatly about it." This woman knew what was happening, felt guilty about it, but was trapped by the system just as much as the servant girl was. Managing servants also meant managing turnover. Servants left positions frequently, for better opportunities, because they were dismissed for incompetence or misbehaviour, because they got married and left service, because they died from illness or accident. When a servant left, you had to hire and train a replacement, which meant reviewing references, conducting interviews, teaching the new person their duties, integrating them into the existing staff hierarchy. And this is where the term mental load becomes so relevant, even though it wouldn't be coined for another 100 years. Elite Victorian women carried an enormous mental load. They had to remember everything, anticipate problems, make countless decisions, manage competing priorities, handle emergencies, and do it all while appearing calm, graceful, and untroubled. If you forgot that it was the parlourmaid's half-day off and didn't arrange coverage, that's on you. If you fail to order enough coal and the house is cold, that's your failure. If the dinner party menu is unbalanced, or the flowers aren't arranged properly, or a guest feels slighted, all of it traces back to you. The responsibility is endless and the standards are impossibly high. A diary entry from 1871 by Lady Elizabeth Cavendish captures this exhaustion beautifully. "I am so tired I can barely hold my pen. Yet I must finish this week's menus and write to cook about Thursday's dinner, and remind butler about the wine cellar inventory, and check with nanny about the children's progress, and plan next week's at homes, and I have not yet answered the letters that arrived this morning. How is it that I am so busy when I'm told I do nothing? How is it that I am so tired when I am told I live a life of leisure?" How indeed? Because here's the cruel joke at the heart of all this. None of it counted as work. When census takers came around, elite married women were classified as having no occupation. Their endless labour was invisible, uncounted, dismissed as merely the natural duties of a wife. Their husbands worked, the servants worked, but they just existed in leisure, doing nothing of economic value. Modern research into unpaid domestic labour has shown that household management and childcare, if paid at market rates, would represent enormous economic value. Victorian elite women weren't compensated at all. They had no income of their own, remember, since all property and earnings belonged to their husbands. They provided what amounted to executive management services for free and received in return room and board and the dubious privilege of being called a lady. And if you complained, If you dared suggest that managing a household of 30+ people was actually quite demanding, you'd be told you were ungrateful for your comfortable life. You'd be reminded of working-class women who laboured in factories or as servants and who would be grateful for your problems. You'd be accused of being lazy or incompetent if you couldn't handle what every proper lady was supposed to manage effortlessly. The gaslighting was systemic and pervasive. Victorian women were worked to exhaustion and then told they did nothing. They carried enormous responsibility and then told they were incapable of serious thought. They managed complex organizations and then told they couldn't handle the rigors of business or politics. The cognitive dissonance must have been maddening. But some women found fulfillment in this work, found ways to take pride in their competence, found meaning in creating beautiful, well-ordered homes for their families. And that's valid too. The problem wasn't that household management was inherently oppressive. It was that women had no choice, no compensation, no recognition, and no ability to pursue anything else. Because buried beneath all this household management were women with other interests, other talents, other dreams. What if you wanted to write, to study, to create art, to engage with ideas beyond menu planning and servant management? What if the mental load of household management was crowding out thoughts and ambitions that had nothing to do with domestic duties? What if the life you were living, however privileged, wasn't the life you wanted to be living at all? Those questions led some women to the one realm where they were allowed to express themselves freely, where their thoughts could escape the confines of the drawing room and reach the wider world. They turned to books, to writing, to the revolutionary act of reading and thinking beyond what society prescribed for them. There's a moment that keeps appearing in Victorian medical texts, and it always makes me both laugh and want to throw something. A doctor will describe a female patient who's suffering from headaches, fatigue, nervous complaints. He'll inquire about her habits, and she'll confess, usually with shame, that she's been reading novels specifically, and the doctor will nod knowingly, as if he's just identified the root cause of her illness. The prescription: stop reading immediately, your brain simply can't handle it. Victorian medical authorities genuinely believed that reading could damage women's health. Too much mental stimulation, they argued, would divert blood away from women's reproductive organs, potentially causing sterility, hysteria, or even insanity. Books, especially novels, were seen as dangerous substances that should be carefully controlled, like drugs or alcohol. Women's minds were too delicate, too impressionable, too weak to handle the excitement and intellectual demands of literature. The irony: women were the primary consumers of Victorian literature. They bought novels in massive numbers, devoured serialized stories in magazines, formed reading circles, and made authors wealth. The same society that told women their brains couldn't handle reading was utterly dependent on women readers to support its publishing industry. Make that make sense. Let me set the scene for what reading actually meant to Victorian women, because I think it's one of the most beautiful and rebellious acts of the entire era. Imagine you're sitting in your drawing room, the household tasks momentarily finished, an hour of precious time before the next social obligation. You pick up a novel, maybe something by a Charles Dickens or Wilkie Collins or one of the Bronte sisters. You open the cover, and suddenly you're transported out of your confined existence into a wider world. For a few hours, you're not a wife, not a mother, not a social performer. You're experiencing other lives, other possibilities, other ways of being. You're engaging your mind with complex narratives, moral questions, social commentary. You're thinking deeply about things that have nothing to do with menu planning or calling cards or whether your daughter's dress is fashionable enough for next week's ball. This was revolutionary. This was escape. This was freedom, at least mental freedom, at least for a little while. An 1873 article in a medical journal by Dr. Edward Clarke, yes, the same one who thought education would damage women's wombs, warned that novel reading caused nervous exhaustion in women because their brains couldn't distinguish fiction from reality. He claimed women readers became so absorbed in novels that they lost touch with their domestic duties and real relationships. His evidence? Absolutely none. Just his conviction that women's minds were fundamentally unstable. But Dr. Clark and his colleagues faced a problem. Educated middle-class and elite women were some of the most literate people in Victorian society. Girls from wealthy families often received excellent educations from governesses and finishing schools. They learned multiple languages, studied history and literature, practiced music and art. They were capable of sophisticated intellectual engagement, and they knew it. So when doctors told them reading novels would damage their health, many women simply didn't believe it. They kept reading, they just did it secretly, or they hid what they were reading, or they pretended they were only reading approved texts like religious books or household management guides while actually devouring sensation novels and gothic romances. There's a wonderful quote from an 1866 diary belonging to a woman named Mary Ellen Peacock. She wrote, "Dr. Morrison has told Mother that my headaches are caused by too much reading and that I must give up novels entirely. I have promised Mother I will comply. I have said nothing about poetry, essays or French literature, so I shall simply switch my contraband. What the good doctor doesn't know won't hurt him, though his ignorance is certainly hurting me. That delicious defiance, that clever loophole finding." Mary Ellen understood that the prohibition was about control, not health, so she obeyed the letter of the restriction while completely violating its spirit. Women got very good at this kind of strategic rule-bending. Now let's talk about what Victorian women were actually reading, because the content matters. The most popular genres were novels, social novels, sensation novels, gothic novels, romance novels. These stories often featured women protagonists dealing with restricted circumstances, fighting against unjust systems, asserting their own desires and needs. The Bronte sisters, Charlotte, Emily and Anne, published some of the most enduring novels of the era. Jane Eyre, published in 1847, features a poor governess who refuses to accept mistreatment and ultimately marries her employer on her own terms, after inheriting money that makes her his financial equal. Wuthering Heights, also 1847, is a wild, passionate story that breaks every rule about proper feminine writing. These books were controversial precisely because they presented women as complex human beings with desires, anger, ambition, and power. Mary Ann Evans wrote under the male pseudonym George Eliot because she knew her novels would be taken more seriously if readers thought a man had written them. Middlemarch, published in 1871 to 1872, is a sweeping social novel that explores marriage, politics, reform, and the limited options available to intelligent women. It's considered one of the greatest novels in English literature, and the author had to pretend to be a man to get it published and read seriously. Do you see the pattern here? Women were writing about women's lives, women's struggles, women's interior worlds, and other women were reading these books and recognizing their own experiences, their own frustrations, their own secret thoughts reflected back at them. Literature created solidarity. It created a shared language for experiences that weren't supposed to be discussed in polite conversation. Critics called these novels dangerous because they were dangerous. Dangerous to the status quo. Dangerous to the idea that women should be content with limitation. Dangerous to the myth that women were naturally suited only for domestic life. Books showed women other possibilities. They sparked questions. They created discontent. And discontent was the last thing the Victorian social system wanted to encourage in women. One particularly delicious controversy involved sensation novels, mystery and suspense stories that often featured crimes, scandals, and socially transgressive behaviour. Wilkie Collins's The Woman in White, published in 1859 to 1860, became a massive bestseller. It features a woman wrongly imprisoned in an asylum by her husband who wants to steal her inheritance. Sound familiar? That plot was drawn from real cases like Caroline Norton's, and it helped publicise the injustices women faced under coverture laws. Critics were horrified. They called sensation novels unhealthy and morbid. They worried that reading about crimes and scandals would corrupt innocent female readers. The Times newspaper published a review in 1862 that warned, "Sensation novels are to the mind what spicy food is to the body, stimulating in small doses, but ultimately unwholesome and capable of creating an unhealthy craving for ever more intense excitement." Women kept reading them anyway. In fact, the moral panic probably boosted sales. There's something irresistible about forbidden fruit, isn't there? But not all reading was transgressive. Many women did read the approved texts, religious devotionals, household management guides, improving literature deemed suitable for female minds. And even this reading was valuable because literacy itself was empowering. The ability to read and write, to engage with ideas, to form and express opinions, these skills were transferable. A woman who read household management books was practicing the same cognitive skills as a woman who reads sensation novels. The brain doesn't care whether you're reading about proper table settings or murder mysteries. It's developing critical thinking either way. And women were writing too. Not just famous authors like the Brontes and George Eliot, but ordinary women keeping diaries, writing letters, composing poetry, crafting essays. Most of this writing was never published, never seen by anyone beyond family and friends. It was women asserting that their thoughts, their observations, their inner lives were worth recording. There's something deeply moving about reading Victorian women's diaries and letters. They're so immediate, so intimate. These women are speaking directly to us across a century and a half, telling us what their lives were really like, what they really thought and felt. They're breaking the silence that society tried to impose on them. Some women formed reading groups, informal clubs where they'd meet to discuss books. These groups were socially acceptable because they were domestic and feminine, just ladies gathering for tea and conversation. But they were also spaces of intellectual exchange where women could share ideas, debate interpretations, and develop critical thinking skills together. An 1889 article in a women's magazine described one such reading group. The ladies meet every Thursday afternoon to discuss their current volume. Last week's heated debate over Mr. Trollope's portrayal of marriage in The Way We Live Now lasted well past the usual departure time, with several participants expressing views on matrimony that would shock their husbands considerably. I love that. I love imagining these women in their corsets and silk gowns, sitting primly with teacups, having radical conversations about marriage and society under the guise of literary discussion. They were creating intellectual community in a world that told them women couldn't be intellectuals. But the medical establishment wouldn't let up. Throughout the Victorian era, doctors continued publishing articles and books warning about the dangers of female reading. An 1876 medical text listed reading as a cause of hysteria, right alongside tight lacing and excessive dancing. The author recommended that nervous women be forbidden access to books, with family members instructed to hide or destroy any novels the patient might try to obtain. Imagine your family being told to hide books from you, like you're an addict who can't be trusted around your substance of choice. Except your substance is literature, and the only thing it's damaging is your willingness to accept your oppression without question. The prohibition on reading extended to educational settings too. Girls' schools and finishing schools taught reading and writing, but often with limitations. Girls learned to read well enough to handle household accounts and religious texts, But higher education in literature, philosophy, or sciences was discouraged or forbidden. The rationale was always the same. Female brains couldn't handle it, and trying would damage their health. Some women fought back against these restrictions through advocacy and institution building. In 1848, Queen's College for Women was founded in London, offering higher education to women despite medical warnings that it would ruin their health. In 1869, Girton College was established at Cambridge University as the first residential college for women. These institutions faced enormous criticism. Doctors predicted that female students would suffer epidemics of hysteria and infertility. Social critics worried that educated women would become unmarriageable. The female students studied anyway. They took the same courses as male students, read the same texts, wrote the same essays, and surprise, they didn't all collapse from brain fever. They didn't become sterile or insane. They just became educated. They proved that all those medical warnings were nonsense, that women's minds were perfectly capable of handling intellectual rigor. But progress was maddeningly slow. Even women who received higher education faced barriers in using it. They couldn't get degrees. Cambridge didn't award degrees to women until 1948, 80 years after Girton was founded. They couldn't pursue most professions. They couldn't vote or hold office. Education gave them knowledge but not power, literacy but not authority. Still, the act of reading and learning was itself a form of resistance. Every woman who insisted on her right to read, who valued her own intellect, who refused to accept that her mind was somehow defective or dangerous, she was pushing back against the system. She was asserting her humanity, her right to think and grow and explore ideas. The novelist George Eliot Mary Ann Evans wrote in an 1856 essay, "The most obstinate barriers are not those built of stone but those built of assumptions. Once women understand they're not naturally inferior, that their minds are as capable as any man's, that their thoughts have value, those are the moments when real change becomes possible." And reading made those moments possible. Books showed women they weren't alone in their thoughts and feelings. Books presented alternative ways of living and being. Books asked questions that society wanted to keep unasked. Books were revolutionary precisely because they operated inside women's minds in a space that even the most restrictive society couldn't fully police. By the late Victorian era, the battle over women's reading had largely been won. Medical opinion slowly shifted as it became obvious that reading wasn't causing epidemics of female insanity. Women's literacy rates had climbed. The publishing industry had grown rich from female readers and recognized them as a crucial market. Female authors were successful and respected, even if they still faced prejudice and barriers. But the victory wasn't complete. Women still faced restrictions on their education, their professional opportunities, their public voices. Having the right to read didn't automatically translate into having the right to vote, to own property, to control their own lives. Reading opened doors in the mind, but the actual doors of society remained largely locked. Yet something had fundamentally changed. Women who read widely, who educated themselves, who developed their intellectual capacities, these women couldn't be convinced anymore that they were naturally inferior. They knew better. They'd proved to themselves, through their own reading and thinking, that the Victorian ideology of feminine limitation was a lie. And some of those women decided that intellectual freedom wasn't enough. They wanted actual freedom. Legal rights, political power, the abilities to shape their own destinies and their society. They'd spent their lives reading about injustice. Now they were ready to fight it. But before we meet those revolutionaries, we need to understand one more aspect of Victorian women's experience, the physical reality of bringing new life into this restrictive world and the terrifying risks that came with it. Motherhood was supposed to be women's highest calling, their natural purpose. But the reality of Victorian childbirth was far from the idealized vision, and the toll it took on women's bodies and lives was something society preferred not to acknowledge. Victorian society had one message for women, repeated endlessly: motherhood is your destiny, your purpose, your greatest joy. Your body exists to create life. Your heart exists to nurture children. Everything you are, everything you could be, finds its truest expression in becoming a mother. It was presented as beautiful, natural, sacred, the pinnacle of feminine existence. What they didn't tell you? That every pregnancy was a lottery where the prize was survival and the cost of losing was your life. Let's talk about the reality of Victorian childbirth, because I think this is where the gap between ideology and reality becomes most stark, most cruel, most impossible to ignore. Society glorified motherhood while providing virtually no support, no safety, no real care for the women who are expected to risk everything to produce the next generation. In 1850, the maternal mortality rate in England was approximately 5 deaths per 1,000 births. That might not sound too bad until you remember that elite Victorian women were expected to have many children. Queen Victoria herself had 9 children between 1840 and 1857. If you had 9 children with a 1 in 200 chance of dying with each birth, your cumulative risk of dying in childbirth over your reproductive years was significant, roughly 4 to 5%. 1 in 20 to 25 women died bringing life into the world. But those are just the death statistics. They don't capture the injuries, the complications, the chronic pain and disability that resulted from difficult births. Obstetric fistulas, tears between the birth canal and bladder or bowel, left women incontinent and in constant pain. Prolapsed uteruses, severe hemorrhaging, infections, permanent nerve damage. Many women survived childbirth but were never truly healthy again. Let me walk you through what childbirth actually looked like for an elite Victorian woman, because the process reveals so much about the period's attitudes toward female pain and female bodies. You're pregnant. You know this because your monthly courses have stopped, though for the first few months you might not be entirely certain. Home pregnancy tests don't exist. You're just waiting, wondering, hoping or dreading depending on how you feel about adding another child to your family. Remember, you have virtually no control over your fertility. If your husband wants children, you'll have children, as many as your body can produce. Once your pregnancy becomes obvious, usually around the 4th or 5th month, you enter a phase called confinement. This term is painfully accurate. You're expected to withdraw from social life, to stop attending parties and making calls, to stay home and prepare for the birth. The idea is that pregnancy is somewhat shameful, that a visibly pregnant woman is indecent, that the evidence of sexual activity, because that's what a pregnant belly represents, shouldn't be displayed in public. Wealthier women might move to the countryside for their confinement, away from London society. They'd spend months in relative isolation, seeing only close family and perhaps a few intimate friends. The loneliness must have been profound, especially for women facing their first birth and terrified of what was coming. As your due date approaches, you prepare the birth room. In elite households, this was often a dedicated lying-in chamber, specially arranged for labour and the weeks of recovery afterward. The windows would be covered with heavy curtains because fresh air was considered dangerous for women in childbirth. The room would be kept very warm, often stifling hot, because cold was also thought to be harmful. You'd be giving birth in a hot, airless, dark room, ideal conditions for bacterial infection, though nobody understood that yet. When labour begins, your husband sends for the doctor, or, more commonly in the early Victorian era, a midwife. Here's where class distinctions become really important. Elite women could afford physicians, who were male and supposedly more educated than female midwives. But male doctors often had less practical experience with childbirth than experienced midwives, and their interventions sometimes did more harm than good. One particularly horrifying practice was the use of forceps. These metal instruments designed to help extract a baby stuck in the birth canal could be life-saving when used correctly, but they could also cause terrible injuries: skull fractures in infants, severe tearing in mothers, infections from the unsterilized metal. Doctors in the 1800s didn't understand germ theory yet. They'd move from patient to patient, from autopsy room to delivery room without washing their hands. They were literally transferring deadly bacteria into women's bodies. The most infamous case of this was puerperal fever, childbed fever, a bacterial infection that killed tens of thousands of new mothers every year. In some hospitals, particularly charity hospitals where medical students practiced, the maternal mortality rate from puerperal fever reached 30%. 3 in 10 women who gave birth in those institutions died of infection afterward. Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis figured out in 1847 that hand-washing with chlorinated lime solution dramatically reduced puerperal fever deaths. His colleagues mocked him. They rejected his findings. They continued delivering babies with unwashed hands, killing women through their arrogant ignorance. Semmelweis died in an asylum in 1865, driven mad by watching women die needlessly while the medical establishment refused to listen. His vindication came too late for the thousands of women who died because doctors wouldn't wash their hands. But back to your labour. You're in that hot, dark room in tremendous pain. Childbirth without pain relief is agonizing. I don't think I need to convince anyone of that. Your body is being ripped apart from the inside as a human being forces its way out. The pain is so intense that women in labour have broken bones from clenching, have bitten through leather straps, have lost consciousness. For most of the Victorian era, this pain was considered natural, inevitable, even morally necessary. Remember the biblical verse from Genesis that was preached from every pulpit, "In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children." Pain in childbirth was God's punishment for Eve's sin, and therefore women's pain was required, deserved, a spiritual necessity. But in 1847 something changed. Queen Victoria herself used chloroform during the birth of her 8th child, Prince Leopold. Chloroform was a relatively new anaesthetic, and its use in childbirth was controversial. Many doctors and clergy argued it was wrong to interfere with God's will, that women should suffer in childbirth as divinely ordained. Queen Victoria didn't care. She wrote in her diary that the chloroform was delightful beyond measure, and used it again for her 9th child in 1853. And because the Queen did it, it became acceptable, at least for women who could afford it and whose doctors were willing to provide it. But chloroform came with its own risks. The dosage was imprecise. Too little and it didn't work, too much and it could kill. Women died from chloroform overdoses during childbirth. And of course, poor women and working-class women had no access to anaesthesia at all. They laboured in agony, as women always had, while elite women had the option of delightful unconsciousness. Let's say you survive the birth. The baby is born, maybe healthy, maybe not. Infant mortality was also high. 1 in 6 children died before age 1, but you've made it through, and now you enter the lying-in period, weeks of mandatory bed rest supposedly necessary for recovery. Except this rest wasn't always restful. You're confined to that hot, dark room. You're not allowed to get up, to move around, to get fresh air. You're on a restricted diet. Bland, minimal food because your digestive system is supposedly too weak after birth to handle real meals. You're in pain from the birth trauma, possibly injured, definitely exhausted, and you're supposed to bond with and nurse your new baby while dealing with all of this. Many elite women used wet nurses, other women, usually working class, who nursed elite babies, while their own babies were often neglected or fed on inferior substitutes. This practice allowed elite women to avoid nursing, which would have tied them down and potentially damaged their figures. But it also meant separation from their newborns during the critical early bonding period. There's something heartbreaking about a system where wealthy women are too damaged by restrictive clothing, poor nutrition, and lack of physical fitness to successfully nurse their own babies, while poor women are required to nurse other women's babies in addition to their own, often at the expense of their own children's health. And then there's postpartum depression. Today we recognize this as a serious medical condition affecting many new mothers. In the Victorian era, it was called puerperal insanity and treated with, you guessed it, isolation, restriction, and sometimes institutionalization. Women who felt depressed, anxious, or overwhelmed after childbirth were told they were suffering from a nervous disorder caused by their weak female constitutions. The idea that maybe, just maybe, being trapped in a dark room for weeks after a traumatic physical experience while responsible for a helpless infant might naturally cause distress, that possibility wasn't seriously considered. Charlotte Perkins, Gilman's postpartum depression, which we mentioned earlier, led to her disastrous experience with the rest cure. How many other women suffered similarly? How many were institutionalized, medicated, or simply left to suffer because their very reasonable emotional responses to difficult circumstances were pathologized as female madness? Let's talk about the physical reality of repeated pregnancies. Queen Victoria had 9 children in 17 years. That means she was either pregnant, giving birth, or recovering from birth for most of those years. Her body barely had time to heal before the next pregnancy began, and Victoria was royalty with access to the best medical care and nutrition available. Ordinary elite women often had even more children. Families with 10, 12, 15 children weren't uncommon. Some women spent literally 20 years in an almost constant cycle of pregnancy and birth. The physical toll was devastating. Teeth falling out due to calcium depletion, bones weakening, organs damaged from repeated pregnancies, bodies simply worn out from continuous reproduction. An 1870 medical journal included a case study of a woman who'd had 14 children in 18 years. The doctor described her as appearing 20 years older than her actual age, with multiple organ prolapses, severe anemia, and chronic exhaustion. His recommendation? That she should avoid becoming pregnant again. His solution for achieving this? Nothing, just avoid it somehow, with a husband who had legal rights to her body and no effective contraception. The advice was useless, cruel in its uselessness. And what about women who didn't want children or didn't want more children? Their desires were irrelevant. Motherhood was mandatory for married women. Refusing your husband's sexual demands could be grounds for him to seek an affair, or even to legally separate from you, while keeping the children and your property. You were trapped in a system that required you to risk your life repeatedly, whether you wanted to or not. Some women did try to control their fertility through various means. Natural family planning methods based on understanding menstrual cycles, though the Victorian understanding of female fertility was often wildly inaccurate. Withdrawal, though this required male cooperation. Douching with various solutions after intercourse, which was ineffective and sometimes harmful. There were also illegal abortions, dangerous procedures performed in secret that themselves carried significant risks of death or permanent injury. The double standard around reproduction was remarkable. Men faced no physical risks from fathering children. They experienced no pregnancy, no childbirth, no nursing. Their bodies weren't damaged by the repeated reproduction, yet they held all the power over reproductive decisions. They decided when and how often to have sex. They decided whether contraception would be used. They decided everything while women bore all the risks. Princess Charlotte of Wales, the heir to the British throne, granddaughter of King George III, died in childbirth in 1817 at age 21. She was royalty, had access to the finest medical care in the kingdom, and it didn't matter. Her baby was stillborn after a long, difficult labour, and she died a few hours later from postpartum hemorrhaging. An entire nation mourned. But her death also demonstrated an uncomfortable truth. No amount of wealth, status, or medical attention could make childbirth truly safe in the 19th century, and yet society continued to romanticize motherhood, to present it as women's highest calling, to pretend that the risks and suffering were insignificant compared to the joy of having children. Women were expected to embrace pregnancy and childbirth enthusiastically, to never complain about the pain or danger, to sacrifice their health and potentially their lives gladly for the sake of continuing the family line. The ideology of maternal sacrifice was so strong that women who died in childbirth were elevated to an almost saintly status. They'd fulfilled their ultimate purpose, given their lives for their children. Their suffering and death were made meaningful through the narrative of noble sacrifice, which is a beautiful story, I suppose, except for the part where women were dying preventable deaths because society wouldn't invest in making childbirth safer or give women any control over their own reproduction. By the late Victorian era, things were slowly improving. Germ theory was finally accepted and hand-washing became standard practice. Anesthesia became more widely available and safer to administer. Antiseptic techniques reduced infection rates. Maternal mortality started to decline, though it remained significantly higher than it would become in the 20th century. But the fundamental problem remained. Women had no reproductive autonomy. They couldn't decide whether to have children, how many to have, or when to have them. Their bodies were subject to their husbands' desires and society's expectations, and every pregnancy remained a risk, a roll of the dice with their lives as the stakes. Some women came through multiple pregnancies relatively unscathed. Others were permanently damaged. Still others died, leaving behind motherless children and grieving families. The lottery was random, cruel, and unavoidable for most married women of the era. As we near the end of our journey through Victorian women's lives, I want you to hold on to this reality of childbirth alongside everything else we've discussed. The restrictive clothing, the social control, the medical abuse, the legal oppression, the invisible labour, and on top of all that, the requirement to risk death repeatedly through pregnancy and childbirth with no choice in the matter. The cumulative weight of it all is staggering. But here's what's remarkable. Despite everything, despite the dangers and difficulties and oppression at every turn, some Victorian women looked at their constrained lives and said no. They said, "This isn't enough, this isn't right, things need to change," and they fought back. They organised, they advocated, they pushed boundaries and broke rules and demanded better. They were rebels in silk dresses, revolutionaries wielding calling cards and parasols as weapons against injustice. Let's meet them now, these extraordinary women who refused to accept their golden cages, and discover how they began to dismantle the very system that had imprisoned them. Not every woman accepted her cage, no matter how gilded. Some looked at the bars and decided to bend them, break them, or slip through them entirely. These weren't always the women you'd expect. Not all of them were radical firebrands or obvious revolutionaries. Sometimes rebellion looked like a society lady showing up to a ball in a dress without a corset. Sometimes it looked like a quiet refusal to stop reading. Sometimes it looked like a mother choosing her career over her marriage and surviving the scandal that followed. Let me introduce you to some of the women who said enough. Because their stories deserve to be told, their courage deserves to be recognised, and their tactics deserve to be studied. Because they worked, Slowly, painfully, incompletely, but they worked. These women changed the world, one broken rule at a time. Let's start with the dress reform movement, because it might seem trivial. Who cares about fashion when women can't vote or own property? But fashion was a physical manifestation of oppression. Changing what women wore was about changing how women moved through the world, literally expanding the space they could occupy and the actions they could perform. The Rational Dress Society was founded in London in 1881 by Viscountess Florence Harberton. The Society's manifesto declared that women's clothing should support health and freedom of movement rather than fashion dictates that damage the body. They argued that no woman should be forced to carry more than 7 pounds of clothing on her body. Remember, fashionable dresses could weigh 14 pounds or more. They were asking for a 50% reduction in the literal weight women carried. The rational dress advocates promoted reform dress, garments with looser waists, shorter skirts that didn't drag on the ground, and revolutionary items like bloomers, which were essentially loose trousers worn under shortened skirts. To modernise, reform dress looks impossibly modest and restrictive. But in the 1880s, it was shocking, scandalous. Women who wore rational dress were mocked in newspapers, caricatured in cartoons, and harassed on the streets. Viscountess Harberton herself was refused service at a hotel in 1899 because she was wearing rational dress that included trousers. The landlady literally would not allow her into the ladies' coffee room. Harberton sued and the case became a national sensation. She lost the case. The court ruled that establishments could set their own dress codes. But the publicity helped normalise the idea that women's clothing choices should be their own business. The aesthetic dress movement took a slightly different approach. Rather than focusing primarily on health and function, aesthetic dress emphasised beauty through looser, more flowing garments inspired by medieval and Renaissance clothing. Artists and intellectuals championed this style. Women like Jane Morris, wife of designer William Morris, wore aesthetic dresses that had no corsets, no crinolines, just draped fabric that moved naturally with the body. Elite society initially dismissed aesthetic dress as bohemian and improper, but gradually elements of it crept into mainstream fashion. By the late 1890s, the most extreme corsets and cage crinolines were falling out of fashion. Skirts were getting shorter, not short by our standards, but shorter than the floor-dragging gowns of earlier decades. Waistlines were loosening incrementally. Reform was happening slowly, one reduced inch at a time, but the most dramatic fashion revolution came from an unexpected source, the bicycle. In the 1890s, cycling became a popular craze. Bicycles offered freedom of movement that women had never experienced before. You could travel miles on your own, without a carriage, without a chaperone, powered by your own body. It was intoxicating, but you cannot ride a bicycle in a floor-length skirt with a corset laced so tight you can barely breathe. It's physically impossible. So women who wanted to cycle had to adopt rational dress. Shorter skirts, bloomers, looser corsets, and society couldn't stop them because bicycling was wholesome exercise, recommended by doctors, fashionable and fun. The bicycle did more to advance dress reform than decades of advocacy had managed. Susan B. Anthony, the famous American suffragist, said in 1896, "Let me tell you what I think of bicycling. I think it has done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. It gives women a feeling of freedom and self-reliance. I stand and rejoice every time I see a woman ride by on a wheel, the picture of free, untrammeled womanhood." Think about that. A simple machine, pedals and wheels and a metal frame, became a tool of liberation because it required women to dress practically, to develop physical strength, to move through public space independently. Fashion reform, it turned out, wasn't trivial at all. It was foundational. Because once women could breathe, once they could move, once they could ride bicycles and play tennis and climb stairs without fainting, well, then you couldn't convince them anymore that they were naturally weak and incapable. Now, let's talk about the women who fought for legal rights. The Married Women's Property Acts were a series of laws passed in the late Victorian era that gradually gave married women the right to own property, keep their own earnings, and exist as separate legal entities from their husbands. The campaign for these laws was led by women like Barbara Lee Smith Bodichon, who founded the English Woman's Journal. In 1858, an organised petition campaigns for married women's property rights. She and other activists collected thousands of signatures, lobbied members of Parliament, published essays and pamphlets explaining why coverture was unjust. The first Married Women's Property Act was passed in 1870, allowing women to keep their own earnings. It seems like such a basic right. The money you earn is yours, but it was revolutionary. Before this, a woman who worked as a writer, teacher, or in any other capacity had to hand over her wages to her husband, who could spend them however he wished. The Act was expanded in 1882 to allow married women to own and control property, to make contracts to sue and be sued. For the first time in centuries, married women became legal persons in their own right. The cage door had opened a crack. But these laws didn't pass because Parliament suddenly developed compassion for women. They passed because women organised, agitated, and refused to shut up about the injustice. Caroline Norton, whose terrible marriage we discussed earlier, spent decades campaigning for these reforms. She wrote pamphlets, published her story, leveraged her social connections to pressure politicians. She never got to benefit from the laws she helped create. Her abusive husband died in 1877, just before the major reforms took effect. But she made the laws possible through her relentless advocacy. Then there were the women who simply refused to conform to expectations, who lived their lives on their own terms and paid the social price for it. George Eliot Mary Ann Evans lived openly with a married man, George Henry Lewis, for over 20 years. They couldn't legally marry because he was still married to his estranged wife, but they considered themselves husband and wife and lived together openly despite the scandal. Elite society shunned Evans. Respectable women wouldn't visit her. She was excluded from social events. Her relationship with Lewis was constantly whispered about as evidence of her immorality. But she continued writing under her pseudonym, producing some of the greatest novels in English literature, supporting herself through her work, living exactly as she chose. When Lewis died in 1878, Evans shocked society again by marrying a man 20 years her junior, John Walter Cross, in 1880. She was 60 years old. She'd already broken every rule about feminine propriety. Why not break one more? She died later that year, having lived life entirely on her own terms. Or consider Josephine Butler, who led the campaign against the Contagious Diseases Acts, laws passed in the 1860s that allowed police to arrest any woman suspected of being a prostitute and force her to undergo humiliating medical examinations. These laws were ostensibly about public health, about controlling the spread of venereal disease among soldiers and sailors, but they only targeted women. The men who used prostitutes faced no consequences. Butler organised a national campaign to repeal these laws. She gave public speeches, something ladies simply didn't do. She wrote pamphlets describing the medical examinations in explicit detail, horrifying polite society with the reality of what was being done to vulnerable women. She faced vicious criticism, threats, social ostracism. Her house was attacked by angry mobs. She persevered. The Contagious Diseases Acts were repealed in 1886 after 17 years of campaigning. Butler had taken on the British government, the military establishment, and Victorian morality about sex, and she had won. She proved that women could be effective political activists, that they could change laws, that they had power if they were willing to use it. And then there were the suffragettes. though technically the major suffragette movement didn't really start until the early 1900s, right at the end of the Victorian era. But the groundwork was being laid throughout the late 1800s by women who insisted that political representation was a basic right, not a masculine privilege. The National Society for Women's Suffrage was founded in 1867. Women like Millicent Garrett Fawcett led the constitutional campaign for voting rights, lobbying politicians, organising petitions, making the case through respectable, ladylike channels. Progress was glacially slow, frustratingly inadequate, but they persisted. Some women took more direct action. In 1868, Lily Maxwell, a shop owner in Manchester, was accidentally included on the electoral register and actually voted in a municipal election before the error was discovered. This one woman casting one ballot caused a massive debate about whether women should be allowed to vote. The answer from the male establishment was a resounding no, but the seed was planted. The fight for women's suffrage consumed decades of effort. Women who joined the cause knew they probably wouldn't live to see victory, and many didn't. But they fought anyway, because it was right, because their daughters and granddaughters deserved better, because someone had to start pushing on those cage doors even if they wouldn't be the ones to walk through. I want to talk for a moment about the cost of rebellion, because these women, the dress reformers, the legal activists, the suffragists, the ones who just lived differently, paid real prices for their choices. Social exclusion, damaged reputations, lost opportunities, harassment, violence. Some lost their children, their marriages, their social positions, everything that Victorian women were taught to value above all else. Florence Nightingale chose her nursing work over marriage and a conventional life, and was estranged from her family for years because of it. Barbara Lee Smith Bodichon was criticised as unfeminine and unmarriageable because of her activism. She did marry, but to a man willing to support her work, which limited her options considerably. Josephine Butler's reputation was so damaged by her campaign against the Contagious Diseases Act that respectable people crossed the street to avoid her. These women sacrificed comfort and acceptance to fight for change. And it's important to remember that most women couldn't afford such sacrifices. If your survival depended on your reputation, if you needed a good marriage to secure your future, if you had children whose prospects would suffer from your scandal, you couldn't afford to rebel openly. The women who could fight were often those with some independent means or unusual support systems, or simply extraordinary courage that allowed them to endure ostracism. So we need to remember the women who couldn't openly rebel too. The ones who pushed boundaries quietly in small ways. The mother who made sure her daughters learned mathematics even though it wasn't ladylike. The wife who quietly saved money from household accounts to give herself some small financial independence. The woman who accidentally forgot her corset at home occasionally just to feel what it was like to breathe fully. These small rebellions mattered too. Because every woman who bent the rules a little, who questioned the system even privately, who raised daughters to expect something better, she was part of the change. Revolution isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's incremental, 1,000 small refusals accumulating until the system can no longer hold. By the end of the Victorian era in 1901, much had changed. Married women had property rights. Educational opportunities had expanded. Universities were accepting female students. Women could become doctors and teachers and pursue professions. Fashion had loosened its stranglehold on women's bodies. The suffrage movement was gaining momentum. The ideology of separate spheres and feminine limitation was being challenged openly. But so much remained unchanged. Women still couldn't vote in parliamentary elections. Divorce was still difficult and socially destructive. Domestic violence and marital rape were still legal. Working women faced discrimination and unequal pay. Social expectations still pressured women into marriage and motherhood above all else. The cage had gotten bigger, the bars were more widely spaced, but it was still a cage. The Victorian rebels knew this. They knew their victories were partial, that there was so much more work to be done. But they'd proved something crucial, that change was possible, that women could organise and advocate and win. They'd proved that the Victorian ideology of natural feminine inferiority was wrong, that given opportunity and education and freedom from restrictive clothing and legal oppression, women were perfectly capable of doing anything men could do. They'd started something that wouldn't be stopped. The momentum they created would carry forward into the 20th century, when more dramatic changes would finally arrive. The rebels in silk dresses had done their work. Now their daughters and granddaughters would finish it. As we approach the end of our journey through Victorian women's lives, one question remains. What happened when this era finally ended? What became of these women and the system that had shaped them? How did the Victorian world transform into something new? And what did that transformation mean for the women who'd lived through it? The answer is both hopeful and heartbreaking, because progress never comes without cost, and the women who paid that cost deserve to have their sacrifices remembered. Queen Victoria died on January 22nd, 1901, after reigning for 63 years. She'd been queen for so long that most of her subjects had never known another monarch. She'd defined an entire era, given it her name, embodied its contradictions, a powerful woman who believed women shouldn't have power, a mother of 9 who idealized domestic femininity while ruling an empire. When she died, something else died with her, not immediately, not dramatically, but the world she'd presided over was already transforming in ways that would have shocked her. The Victorian era was ending, and the women who'd lived through it, who'd survived it, were about to witness changes that would have seemed impossible just decades earlier. But before we talk about what came next, we need to talk about what was lost. Because not all Victorian women made it to see the new century. Not all of them lived long enough to benefit from the reforms they'd fought for. Some fell silently, their deaths unrecorded, except in family Bibles and parish registers, their stories lost to history. The phrase silent falls refers to exactly this. The women who didn't survive their gilded cages, who paid the ultimate price for Victorian society's treatment of women. Let's remember them for a moment. The women who died in childbirth, having fulfilled their supposed destiny at the cost of their lives. We talked about the statistics earlier, but behind every statistic is a person. A woman who might have been 22 or 35 or 40, who left behind children who needed her, who had dreams and thoughts and a whole life unlived. The maternal mortality rate was 5 per 1,000 live births, which sounds clinical until you remember that means thousands of women every year gone forever, their potential erased. The women who died from preventable illnesses made deadly by corsets, malnutrition, and toxic fashion. How many women died from arsenic poisoning that was never properly diagnosed? How many succumbed to infections because their bodies were too weakened by restriction and poor diet to fight off disease? We'll never know the exact numbers. Their deaths were attributed to mysterious feminine ailments, to weak constitutions, to natural frailty, never to the system that had damaged them. The women who took their own lives, unable to bear the weight of impossible expectations and inescapable circumstances. Victorian culture didn't talk openly about suicide, especially female suicide. So these deaths were often recorded as accidents or illnesses. But they happened. Women who saw no way out of abusive marriages, women institutionalized for having opinions or ambitions, women who simply couldn't endure another day of performing perfect femininity. Some chose death over continued suffering. An 1885 diary entry by a physician named Dr. William Acton notes almost casually, Had another case this week of a lady who took laudanum in excessive quantity. The family insists it was accidental, taken for insomnia, but the quantity consumed suggests otherwise. This is the third such accident I have attended this year. 3 women in 1 year in one doctor's practice, dead from what were almost certainly suicide disguised as accidents. How many others never made it into any records at all? We need to acknowledge these silent falls because they were consequences of the system we've been exploring. These weren't random tragedies. They were predictable outcomes of treating women as property, of denying them autonomy, of constructing a social system that valued women's appearance and reproductive capacity while denying their humanity. But let's also talk about the women who survived, who made it through the Victorian era and lived to see the 20th century arrive. Because of them, the transformation must have been both exhilarating and disorienting. The First World War, which began in 1914, would shatter many Victorian conventions. With millions of men away at war, women flooded into jobs previously reserved for men. They worked in munitions factories, drove ambulances, served as nurses close to the front lines. They proved they could do physically demanding work, handle responsibility, make crucial decisions. The separate spheres ideology crumbled under the practical necessity of war. And in 1918, women over 30 who met certain property qualifications finally won the right to vote in Britain. The Representation of the People Act was passed, granting suffrage to about 8.4 million women. It wasn't full equality. Men could vote at 21 regardless of property ownership, and younger women were still excluded. But it was victory, partial and long overdue, but still victory. Imagine being a woman who'd campaigned for suffrage in the 1880s and 90s, who'd been mocked and dismissed and told that women's brains couldn't handle political decisions, and then living to see women vote, see them stand for office, see them shape the laws that govern their own lives. Some of the Victorian suffragists did live to see this. Millicent Garrett. Fawcett was 71 in 1918. She'd been fighting for 50 years. She finally got to vote. Fashion changed dramatically. By the 1920s, women's clothing bore almost no resemblance to Victorian fashion. Gone were the corsets and crinolines and layers upon layers of restrictive fabric. Dresses became shorter, looser, lighter. Women bobbed their hair. They wore trousers for sports and casual wear. The physical liberation that dress reformers had fought for had arrived, though in forms even they might not have predicted. Legal rights expanded. Divorce became somewhat easier and less socially destructive. Married women's property rights were fully secured. Women could enter professions, though they still faced discrimination and unequal pay. Contraception became more available, giving women increasing control over their own fertility. The cage was opening slowly but undeniably. But here's what I find most interesting. Many women who'd grown up Victorian never fully adjusted to these changes. They'd internalized the rules so completely that even when external restrictions lifted, internal ones remained. There are accounts of elderly Edwardian and Georgian women who still insisted on wearing corsets long after they had gone out of fashion, who still observed calling card protocols when everyone else had abandoned them, who still believed that proper ladies didn't vote or work or live independently. They'd been shaped by their era so fundamentally that they couldn't fully shed its constraints even when given permission to. The cage had been psychological as well as physical, and some women remained imprisoned even after the doors were opened. And we need to talk about class, because the benefits of these changes weren't distributed equally. Elite and middle-class women gained from legal reforms, educational opportunities, and new social freedoms. But working-class women still struggled with poverty, still faced exploitation in factories and as domestic servants, still had limited options and few protections. The suffrage movement's victory in 1918 only enfranchised propertied women over 30, deliberately excluding younger and poorer women. Progress came in waves, and each wave lifted some boats while leaving others behind. The Victorian women who benefited from change were usually those with education, resources, and social connections. The ones who remained trapped were those without those advantages. So what's the legacy of Victorian elite women? What do we inherit from their experiences, their suffering, their resistance? First, I think we inherit a cautionary tale about how systems of oppression work. Victorian society didn't oppress women through crude force, it oppressed them through ideology, through convincing them that their restrictions were natural, that their suffering was necessary, that the gilded cage was actually a palace. It enlisted women in their own oppression, made them enforce the rules on each other, turned what should have been solidarity into competition and judgment. We still see these patterns today. Beauty standards that damage women's health but are presented as choices, work structures that demand women handle all domestic labour while also maintaining careers, social media that encourages women to perform perfect lives for an audience while hiding their struggles. The mechanisms have evolved, but the fundamental dynamic, oppression disguised as feminine virtue, persists. Second, we inherit the knowledge that resistance is always possible, even within highly restrictive systems. Victorian women found ways to push back to create space for themselves, to support each other, to incrementally change their world. They couldn't dismantle the entire system overnight, but they didn't have to. They just had to keep pushing, keep refusing to accept that their circumstances were inevitable. Third, we inherit both the benefits and the unfinished work of Victorian women's struggles. We have rights they fought for, property rights, educational access, political representation, but we still fight battles they'd recognise. Reproductive autonomy, equal pay, freedom from violence, control over our own bodies. The Victorian era ended, but some of its assumptions about women, about femininity, about what women owe to society versus what society owes to women, those assumptions haven't fully died. I want to end by circling back to where we began, to that woman standing in a drawing room in a silk dress, worth a fortune, surrounded by luxury, trapped in a golden cage. We've walked through her day, examined her restrictions, witnessed her suffering, celebrated her resistance. We've seen her as fully human, not a costume drama character or romantic ideal, but a real person navigating impossible circumstances with whatever resources she had available. Some days she survived, some days she even found joy, meaning, purpose within her constraints, and some days the weight of it all was unbearable. All of those experiences were real and valid and part of the complex truth of Victorian women's lives. The golden cage is a powerful metaphor, but we need to be careful with it, because cages don't just open on their own. They're opened by people, usually the ones locked inside them, who refuse to accept their imprisonment, who work together to bend the bars, who sacrifice safety and comfort to create change for those who come after. Victorian elite women weren't just victims of their era. They were also agents of change, rebels, survivors, fighters. They were complicated human beings living in a complicated time. Some accepted their circumstances, some resented them, some fought against them. Most probably did all three at different moments, depending on their circumstances and their courage and their resources. And here's the thing, we're still those women in a way. We're still navigating systems that constrain us while pretending they liberate us. We're still performing femininity for audiences that judge us constantly. We're still carrying invisible labour that nobody acknowledges. We're still fighting for rights that should be basic, for respect that should be automatic, for safety that should be guaranteed. The Victorian era ended over a century ago, but we're still living with its echoes. The assumptions it made about women, about femininity, about what women are and should be, those assumptions are woven into our culture so deeply that we often don't even see them. But they're there, in how we talk about women's bodies, women's work, women's choices, in what we expect from mothers and wives and professional women, in the double standards that persist despite legal equality. So what do we do with this history? We remember it. We learn from it. We use it to understand our present and imagine our future. We honour the women who didn't survive their golden cages by making sure we don't build new ones. We honour the women who fought by continuing their fight. We honour the women who endured by acknowledging their strength and refusing to romanticize their suffering. The Victorian era of silk dresses and silent falls is over, but its lessons remain urgent and necessary, because understanding how oppression worked then helps us recognize how it works now. Seeing how women resisted then inspires us to resist now. Knowing what they sacrificed reminds us what's at stake. And so we close this chapter of history, these stories of Victorian elite women, with gratitude for their lives and their struggles, with sorrow for those who fell silently, and with determination to keep opening cages, keep fighting for freedom, keep insisting that women are fully human and deserve to be treated as such. Thank you so much for staying with me on this journey. Thank you for listening to these stories, for caring about these women, for taking the time to understand a world that's gone but not forgotten. I hope you found something valuable here, maybe a new perspective, maybe a deeper appreciation for how far we've come, maybe inspiration for the work that still needs doing. Your engagement with these stories matters. Every person who learns this history, who refuses to let these women be forgotten, who carries these lessons forward, you're part of keeping their legacy alive. You're part of ensuring that they didn't suffer in vain, that their fights weren't futile, that progress continues. If this story moved you, if it changed how you see history or the present or yourself, I'd love to hear about it. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, tell me which part resonated most with you. Where are you in the world as you listen to this? What connections did you make between then and now? Your reflections add to the conversation, create community, remind us all that we're not alone in grappling with these big questions about gender and power and freedom. And when you're ready, come back for the next story. Because history is full of women who were told they didn't matter, who proved everyone wrong, who changed the world despite every obstacle. Their stories are waiting to be told, and I can't wait to share them with you. Until then, take care of yourselves, rest well, and remember, you're the inheritors of these women's courage, their resilience, their refusal to accept that cages are permanent. You're part of their legacy. Make it count. Good night.